Um, right, I'm hoping that we can keep the time. We're already dropped by 6 minutes, but everybody is here, I think. Welcome to this symposium on film and architecture. It is the occasion, I believe, this year of a new project to build a film studio in Liverpool in the old Littlewoods building. So that's a rather good omen and prospect. I'm not going to go into long introductions for everybody right now because you've got the program and I'll introduce people individually as they come up. But we have some very distinguished guests and I hope you'll give them all attention. But I'm going to start straight off myself now. Now, I'll just recapitulate what I wrote in the note because it sums up the essence of my interest in this and how I came to think it was worthwhile doing, along, I should say, with Philip, who shares all of my interest in these areas. So I wrote 2 reasons why architects should watch the movies. Films offer 2 unique means of spatial rendition. First, by movement in 3 ways: through montage, through alterations in focal range, and through camera mobility. The second occurs in fiction films through characters acting out of behavioral, affective, and psychological potentials that are inhering but often suppressed in actual buildings and places. Thus, films present a vast archive of evidence in images of how rooms, buildings, places, and scapes might be really lived, both as truth 24 times a second, as Jean-Luc Godard described film, and as a ribbon of dreams in Orson Welles' account. Now, before I begin reading my text, I'm going to start to show some images. I'm going to leave these images running except when they get ahead of me and I might have to stop. But the reason I'm showing these to begin, before I start, I came across them. They're Orson Welles' last film, I think, F for Fake, and it is the end of the film nearly. It's a kind of elegy for his own work, and it's a paean of praise to Chartres Cathedral. And what is interesting is that he doesn't show moving images. It is, after all, a building. There's a kind of montage, a drift from one shot to another, very beautiful light. But it raises the question, do we need movies to show buildings? And that's a question that I want to ask. So I'll start reading now. Why should architects watch the movies? What can they learn from them? What can they do that other kinds of document cannot? How can movies contribute anything special to our understanding of buildings and places which stand still? A building may be recorded by plans, elevations, sections, or by projections such as axonometrics, perspectives, or photographs. I show you the Villa Müller from Adolf Loos, ironically because Loos did not like photographs of his buildings. He didn't think that photographs could do justice to his buildings. I don't know what he would have made of films, but the curious thing is, as Beatrice Colomina has shown, his buildings are amazingly cinematic in the sense of viewing, setting up one room as viewing and surveilling another. So each of these techniques, section, projection, and so on, present unique kinds of information and can convey particular qualities in their motifs. What special faculty can film bring to the representation of buildings and places? For which kinds of qualities and phenomena are movies especially apt? And how might architectural lessons in film be studied? Although the kinematograph is 120 years old, only recently has close attention been given to the capacity of moving pictures for spatial and architectural representation. At first, this may not surprise us. For as buildings stand still while movie images move, some may suppose they're used to be limited to time-lapse records of buildings, construction, or of shadows. But I don't think these get us very far. In any case, that misses two factors that make movies different from static renditions. Two reasons why architects should watch movies. The first is that the camera itself can move in space. It can move from shot to shot in montage, and here we see Eisenstein's montage from his October film. It can move its focus through depth of field, and it can move literally on tracks, dollies, drones, or Steadicam. So this is still from Citizen Kane. Orson Welles famously loved to shoot in deep focus, and here you see Citizen Kane typing out the opera review for his wife's disastrous performance in a rather interesting concrete frame building by the looks of it. And here, deep focus again used for Citizen Kane, but this time going back into forever, and yet showing nothing but more and more and more Citizen Kane. So it can move through montage, through focus and depth of field, and it can move literally on tracks, dollies, drones, or Steadicam. Around, under, and over sites and scenes. The second reason for studying movies is that films can show the behavior of people in time, interacting with each other and with their ambience. Time and timing, as Cedric Price noted, are as important in architecture as space and spacing. Here is the opening scene from Alexander Nevsky going up in a hot air balloon in the Middle Ages. Rather alarming view. I've been to that church. And here's Cedric Price, a chart of his drawings concerning the possibilities of timing and why timing can be interesting and crucial to architecture. Moreover, fictions filmed on real locations can enscene actions that may expose qualities in those locations that were unintended by their commissioners and unprojected by their designers, and yet which lay potential in them. We might even propose, like Bernard Tschumi, that such films can expose the real significance of places in, as it were, a psychoanalysis of their unconscious origins and motives. Such exposure need not require dramatic shots or elaborate mise-en-scène, because slow film can be just as revelatory. Just attending to scenes with but elliptic commentary, as do Patrick Keeler's and Terence Davies's films and their fictive documentaries show, or in Antonioni's lingering vacancies. They may draw our awareness to significance in not just a place or a scene, but also in its originating history. This is from Terence Davies's film Time and the City. It's a montage of historical documentary film, but put to an astonishingly beautiful soundtrack. So our attention here is to the spatial techniques of kinematography itself, in both documentary and in fiction filming. We seek to track relations of camera, actor, and scene, from intimate liaisons and interiors to the broad and multi-subjective ambit of the city, to technique applied to every variety of topographic, architectural, and social motif, seen and heard at every scale from intimate to public, from lyric to epic. We look here not at mere backdrops, nor at stylish or spectacular studio sets, but at interactions of actors and cameras with spatial and psychological conditions offered by the set or location. This is from the last film that Antonioni made was Wim Wenders, Beyond the Clouds. And in watching fiction film, our attention is to how characters' subjectivities, engaging with the objectivity of their sets or locations, may bring out in their architecture affective and kinesthetic qualities that only film can render. So let's look closer at these two ways whereby movies may tell about space and architecture. Both involve movements, of course, for are not films called kino, movies? But more essentially, they entail change and time. Time is registered in change, and movement is but one kind of change. Movies ought to be called changes, because their essential subject is change. Andy Warhol's 8-hour film of the Empire State Building showed no movement, only changes in light and atmosphere. Certainly, however, the changes that films mostly show are movements. Movement is change in position or location. All buildings and places, no matter how static or seeming timeless, are surrounded and permeated by objective events, weather, light, sound, the comings and goings of men and their works. And so the first topic of the filmic faculty becomes evident, namely the activities around and within buildings and places, acts which occur during time and which no still image could show. Thus, an early British documentary showed the workings of a biscuit factory, and Lumiere's first film, here we are looking at it, showed the arrival of a train at a station. Not only the train, and not just the station, but the event of their convergence, the arrival. And here's Boccioni's painting of the departures set in a railway station, futurist painting. But note that those three, train, station, arrival, could be presented as successive moments, successive shots in time, and this would also be an ellipsis in space. This is montage, the first of three kinds of movements that I want to indicate. It is not literal but phenomenal, for as its transits are apprehended by our imagination, each image in a montage could be shot from a static camera, possibly even with a static picture, but certainly a static camera looking at a moving picture. The real movement in montage between the shots. Sergei Eisenstein illustrated this in poetry articulated, he says, not with the limits of the line, but with the limits of the shot. So here's Eisenstein's shot of the storming of the Winter Palace. And here's Eisenstein's text in his book Film Sense. He writes, Mayakovsky does not work in lines, emptiness, wing aloft, into the stars carving your way. He works in shots, emptiness, wing aloft, into the stars carving your way. This is a film about Yesenin, a poet who committed suicide, and it's a memorial to him. Here, Mayakovsky cuts his line just as an experienced film editor would in constructing a typical sequence of impact, the stars and Yesenin. First the one, then the other, followed by the impact of the one against the other. One, emptiness. If we were to film this shot, we should frame the stars so as to emphasize the void, and yet at the same time making their presence felt. 2, wings aloft. 3, and only in the third shot, if we were, do we plainly portray the contents of the first and second shots in the circumstances of impact. For his soundtrack film, Alexander Nevsky, Eisenstein drew a synchronous notation of shots, directions, and Prokofiev's music score. He sought to convey his ideas in diagrams that Bernard Tschumi would later try to adapt so as to notate what he called the discourse of events as codes to architectural form. Here's Eisenstein's diagrammatic analysis. But I think that as Eisenstein's diagrams were not always easy to read, as to whether they were tracing movements of actors, camera, or the viewer's eye, Tumi's drawings tended to elide traces of events into, I think, facile templates for modeling the ambience. It's an interesting experiment, but I think a kind of failed experiment on Bernard's part. More architecturally fertile, I think, is an Eisenstein drawing for Ivan the Terrible. It is an axonometric, showing the depth, the path of a character up to a corridor, along to a vaulted chamber. Here we have it. Along to a vaulted chamber and upstairs again to a tower. But it also indicates camera positions and I think lighting directions. For the journey was not followed continuously, but in a sequence, a montage of shots, each differently lit to vary the mood or affect of each kind of image. Each image. This kind of multi-scene axo was adopted by Tumi's student Nigel Coates to take a viewer on a path through his interiors, while revealing simultaneously the three-dimensional relations. So here we are going up the tower to goodness knows where, some kind of, we don't know yet, the sort of tension in a film is always important, and maybe we're going to meet Ivan himself. Here's some stills from that film. I'm going to speed this up a little bit. So just to go back. And here's Nigel's axonometrics, his exploded X-ray axos, as he calls them. And of course, I think they were all looking at films in Diploma Unit 10 with Bernard, and when they formed a group, they called it Narrative Architecture today. This is a proposal for an airport with sort of drifting through it, and leading our way to the airplane. It may have been that montage was inspired by cartoon strips like Little Nemo in Slumberland, which was started in 1905, which framed a sequence of scenes in stories which, as they were a boy's dreams, roamed wildly across scales and locations, just as the movies would. Not surprisingly, a leader here was Walt Disney, but as a way to plan production in Hollywood's studio system, storyboards were used by many directors, notably Alfred Hitchcock, who commissioned them from accomplished artists such as Saul Bass. So here he is dreaming of being a giant in a miniature New York. And this is a Google spread of storyboards of Saul Bass and Alfred Hitchcock. You can see Psycho down there. Okay, let's speed this up a little bit. Now, the astonishing thing is that if you Google architecture storyboards today, you get as many images as you get for film storyboards. I'll come to this in a moment. In France, the graphic novel form known as photoroman was itself made into a film in Chris Marker's La Jetée, which became for Bernard Tumi's AA Unit 10 in the late 70s, a model, along with video, for designing time and narrative interspatial projects. For by 1983, when Unit 10 exhibited Discourse of Events, the exhibition that brought them to public notice, 20 years after the Hughes Aircraft Corporation had translated it from Hollywood to engineering, the storyboard had become an architectural design tool. The Google pages for architecture storyboards are now as extensive as those for film storyboards. So here's La Jetée in the form that was given to me as a book, and the photographs turn on each page, just like a kind of an illustrated photo roman. And I'll zap it forward a bit. There's a spreadsheet from Google of La Jetée. And here is some of the film sequence itself. There's no movement in this, simply sequence of stills, a montage in which we move through time and space imaginatively, I would say in the terms of Colin Rowe, phenomenally rather than literally. This is the final sequence, which it loops around in a kind of temporal sequence. You need to know the story to understand what's happening, but it's very beautifully shot on the terrace of the public terrace of Orly Airport. So you're imagining motion here, but you're not seeing it literally. And of course, the word motion, ever since Heinrich Wilflin talked about Baroque in the 1880s, has been a key word in all architectural descriptions. So here's Diploma Unit 10's exhibition, The Discourse of Events, 1983, some pages from it. There's Mark Prizeman's design for a chemical factory that you live in, using a section. The sections become enormously important in those projects because they're like a kind of unrolling film. Now, the second kind of film movement that I want to present is that within what is called depth of field. I would prefer to call it range of focus, as this suggests the roaming of attention within the depths of a picture that, with improving technology since the 1940s, films have increasingly invited. I don't so much mean here zooming towards or zooming back from distant objects, but the drawing of attention within a scene, opening or closing a lens aperture, narrows or deepens its focal plane, which may also be shifted from near to distant. The artist John Hilliard has used this in several trio pictures. One focuses on a foreplane, the next on a midplane, and the third on a far plane, each cueing a different fictive implication. In a movie, this transit can be made continuous in time by shifting focus, as in a film of pavilions built by Hilliard's friend Dan Graham. Graham's pavilions are in fact optical devices, less to be looked at than as with a camera. Combining window and mirror, they montage and mingle images of those in and around them at varying depths, angles, and degrees of engagement with each other. Indeed, in his earlier performances and pavilions combined mirrors with delayed video feedback to overlay not just planes in space and spacing, but in time and timing. And at this point, I would remind you that right now you have an almost unique opportunity to see one of those early pavilions at the Tate down at the Albert Dock, because they brought it over from the Pompidou, present continuous past, one of his video delay chambers. Fictional cues aroused by figures in depth were explored in several works by John Hilliard, such as Safe for Dan Graham, which set up a cryptic scene through a two-way mirror in Graham's Serpentine Pavilion, gallery pavilion, towards the interior of the adjoining Serpentine Gallery. So at different depths of field, you see different figures, each would have a slightly different kind of relation to this woman. In a way, it's distantly inspired by the painting by Tintoretto of Susanna and the Elders. But in fact, I think I was talking about this with him the other day. It's more or less a kind of scene from a detective story as much as anything else. Fictional cues aroused by figures in depth were explored in several works by Hilliard. Painters, above all, Velázquez knew how to shift attention within pictures. In Christ in the House of Mary and Martha, Las Hilanderas and Las Meninas, our eye is drawn back and forth by a variety not far from what Eisenstein called montage of attractions. Likewise, as Beatrice Colomina has shown, Adolphe Loos and Le Corbusier played similar games with the gaze. In Loos's Muller House, the music salon and adjoining dining rooms are at different heights, but adjoin like a domestic theatre. In films, we really see these dramas acted out. Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train puts a quarreling couple on display in a glass cage, a soundproof booth in a music shop, where we see three groups overlaid in transparent succession. Just speed this up a little bit. So here's a Dan Graham pavilion. It's a pavilion for viewing videos. With multiple reflections in two mirror glass. And here's the scene from Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train, where this couple are having a quarrel, and you see another couple behind them, and another one behind them, and then outside beyond the window, you see the street. And so there's three different kinds of layers of narrative, as it were, going on top of one another, but they're going on independently without reference to each other. I think I'm going to have to finish quite soon. Be very careful. So two great exponents of arranging focus in depth were Orson Welles and his cameraman Greg Toland. Welles loved to set forefigure against far figure, framing one within or beyond another, and entangling them both optically and fatally in destinies that, like Citizen Kane's long-lost innocence, the mirror labyrinth in The Lady from Shanghai, and the accusations against Anthony Perkins in The Trial, were unfathomable. So here's a scene from The Trial. In deep focus. It's where he says, I just want to get out. I want to find my way out. Of course, he's not going to find his way out. Now, the third kind of movement that I'll show, that of the camera itself, was also demonstrated by Welles in his opening scene for A Touch of Evil. As we follow a ticking bomb, we're taken in a single shot on a three-axis tour through streets, over a national border, and across a parade of subjects and citizens. This is a continuous shot. It's all done on dollies and tracking. And of course, it's depending very greatly, again, on suspense. Where are we going? What will happen? We know there's a bomb in that car. And then a different narrative crosses it. This is the main narrative of the hero and heroine, Charlton Heston and Janet Leigh, who of course narrowly escaped being blown up. Still continuous shot, still tracking. Crisscross, the border. Still continuous shot. Now she hears the ticking in the back of the car. Is there something wrong? Nobody takes any notice. The camera changes to show the couple, but still continuous shot, and first cut. I think another virtuoso here was the Russian director Mikhail Kalatozov. His film I Am Cuba includes two astonishing, continuously moving takes. The first descends from a rooftop through the tourist luxuries of Batista's Havana, and the second ascends from a protester's funeral to a rooftop cigar factory and out through a window to rejoin the funeral. Now an exultant procession of the people seen from the sky. It is perhaps the mobile camera in this kind of movement that offers the most to architecture. I think it does so in two ways. In the first, like a train or a car driver, we advance into space. This is the fly-through vantage, much favored now in architectural presentations to clients, but usually dull because they show nothing but surfaces and paths. But in films, these are very often exciting, for they advance not only into space, but into the future, where stuff happens. The question is not where, but whither. Whither is Kim Novak going as Scotty follows her in Vertigo? Downwards, for sure. And whither goes that creepy turn in so many of David Lynch's corridors? Likely in a loop backwards. Indeed, in Floating Through the Hermitage Museum, Sokharov's Russian Ark, the camera subject is adrift in time, where past, present, and even the future all co-mingle presently. I'm going to finish the lecture on this page, but I just want to take you through those shots that I've just described. So here's the camera descending from a rooftop fashion or beauty parade down the side of the building, and then it actually ends up underwater in one continuous moving shot. And this is shot, 50 years ago, no Steadicam, no video. And that's pretty much the beginning of the film. It shows the luxurious world of the tourists before the revolution, because most of the film is concerned with the... Then, this is much later in the film, a demonstrator, a student has been killed by the police, and there's a popular procession at his funeral. Begins with bells, very Russian. Looks down, first of all, from a kind of heavenly viewpoint, and then goes down to join the masses. I'll just speed this a little bit. We're at the street level. Among the people, continuous shot. And now the camera begins to rise again up the side of a building. And this is done to a very, very exalted orchestral score. And it reaches the roof terrace, and then it goes across the street, still one continuous shot. And this time, instead of it being a beauty parade, we're in a factory, a cigar factory. And now we go through the factory. And this is the really astonishing thing. It just continues straight on out. If you look carefully in the original film, you see wires, but they must have simply passed the camera out on these wires and sent it traveling above the street. And here's Vertigo. This is James Stewart trailing Maddie down to where she tries to kill herself in the river, in the bay. He saves her, but then the following day finds her he's following her again, and she just loops back to his own house this time. But all the shots are always going down. Every single shot is going down and down and down and down. He's a detective. He's been hired to find out what she's doing in her trance-like walks. But the whole thing is set up a bit. Now, in Russian Ark, I think it's the apotheosis of this kind of shot, because it's 100 minutes single shot. It's only possible because of video and Steadicam. And the whole thing was set up with incredible elaboration as a tour through the Hermitage in space and time. It is extraordinarily beautiful. It is the antithesis of Eisenstein's version of the Winter Palace in October. In October, both the building and time are ruptured by assault and montage. The clock is reset to revolutionary time. In Sokurov's Hermitage, whereas, time is an emulsion, wherein, as in museums and in movies, nothing is lost. All is recorded and sustained. Russian Ark testifies to a longing for cultural continuity in Russia that inspired Mir Iskусство, the world of art movement that was founded by Alexandre Benoit, the first director of the Hermitage. Now, the second kind of moving shot that I want to show you, and I'm going to speed this up madly now, is the lateral tracking shot. It's the last thing that I want to describe. Here is a lateral tracking shot where you're looking sideways as you move along like this, as if you're looking out of a train window. In fact, in many ways, it's the characteristic way. There is something, I think, epic about the lateral tracking shot. Here, for instance, in the opening scene of Mitsuguchi's Sisters of the Gion, it unfolds like an animated scroll showing the breakdown of a careful culture to cynical commerce. This is the opening scene. A man's business is being auctioned off. It's very good because within the first few minutes it manipulates your emotions. At first you feel sympathy for this man, but in fact the man is a complete rotter later on, as you realize. But the camera just keeps moving past this auction. Notice how they're sitting on the floor. Now, I'm not going to try to illustrate this too much, but it's really the second big point that I want to make, is what the film can show us is actually how we occupy space, how we live in it, how it can be lived in. In this case, you could ask the question, how do you sit on the floor? Well, watch a Japanese film by Ozu or Mitsuguchi. it shows you. And now the camera turns, that's me, and you come to the scene of the owner talking to his business colleague. The tracking has ended. And then finally there's a diagonal shot which shows his wife and baby, who he's about to walk off from. It's rather long, but it's worth holding on for that final diagonal shot. One of the problems with showing movies in lectures is that the movies take real time. So there's the diagonal shot showing the kind of private life of the family on the far side of a threshold. The double faculty of the moving camera for subjective story as well as epic history has been useful to both documentary and fiction films, and evident in the work of one who made both, Alain Resnais. In two of his documentaries, the histories and workings of buildings, a library and a concentration camp, are unrolled by a moving camera in successive and shifting parallaxes. One film shows the winning of order from chaos, the library, and the other shows the degeneration of order into barbarity. What is disturbing is what the searching camera betrays, that the cultural archive and the Gestapo file shared common bureaucratic methods. The will to order is ambiguous. So this is from the opening shots of Night and Fog, his very famous film of Auschwitz. I think the effect of parallax, of seeing one thing pass in front of another when they're lined up like that, is enormously powerful in lateral tracking shots. And I think it's something very, very important. And then it cuts to the same kind of order in these serried ranks of stormtroopers. Now here is the opening of his wonderful film called All the Memories of the World, about the Bibliothèque Nationale by Labrouste in Paris. Man accumulates countless memories. He can't store them. It opens with a scene of kind of chaos and entropy. It's almost like the last scene in Citizen Kane. Everything's piled up, it's getting out of control. And the library and the archives bring order to this. But it's I think he filmed it in a very strange way. I think he was influenced by Georges Bataille, who had worked in the Bibliothèque Nationale and who famously described all architecture, all buildings, as potential traps. Just speed this up a little bit. It is absolutely full of these continuous tracking shots past the archives, the stacks. When Resnais came to make last year in Marienbad a fiction film, Resnais, I think, put the methods of the archive and the documentary into a fiction which rendered impossible any will to order it as a story with a true origin and a conclusive outcome. It disposes in a hotel whose architectural order and definition are repeatedly emphasized in tracking shots. Three characters whose relations and histories are, as in multiple reflections in Rococo mirrors, repeatedly redisposed and replayed. Marienbad has been called the most architectural of movies, but it uses the ordering power of architecture in a building to question any hope of order in human relations. Indeed, so confining is Marienbad's palatial hotel that it approaches the view of Georges Bataille, who worked in the library, that all buildings were traps wherefrom the only escape may be through wandering. So this is the opening of the last year in Marienbad. Indeed, our three ways of wandering are matched in the movies. The wandering mind, prone to errancy and elision, has its correspondence in montage. The wandering eye, in the cameras roaming through variable focal ranges and objects. And the wandering person is doubled in the moving camera itself. Yet these three escapes from architecture have parallels in architectural form itself. Colin Rowe differentiated phenomenal from literal transparency. Perhaps montage, in its imaginative motion from shot to shot, can be described as a phenomenal movement. Focal ranging is a hybrid mode, involving viewers in movements that may be both phenomenal and literal. In mobile shots, we encounter movements that are literal, but bring to us significant phenomenal effects of succession and of parallax. In discussing what Moholy Nagy called vision in motion, the labyrinthine aporias of Hotel Marienbad have brought me finally to the second reason for the architects to study movies. This is not a matter of representational or formal technique. Rather, the lessons here are experiential. We might even say existential. They concern nothing less than how to live. How to live, that is, not only in the present or the current, but in the possible, the conceivable, the imaginable. This has been a reason given for fiction and drama ever since Aristotle. But I think that films have brought something new to it, because so many films can enscene their actions in places that are substantially realized and lit, indeed often shot in actually real locations, be they a doorway, window, hall, bedroom, mezzanine, terrace, balcony, yard, garden, park, street, plaza, tower, vista, or prospect, that they now, 120 years since Lumiere, contain a vast archive of not just architectural views, but of architectural scenes. A scene is a view of an event, or of a site where an event took place. Scenes show not just places, but what was possible there, what indeed could indeed take place there. And surely, if one is to design a place, one ought to know what could, what might take place there. What I have called, from the German word Möglichkeit, its mightlihood. A likelihood is likely to take place. A mightlihood might take place. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure if you can you hear me at the back? Apparently not. Anyway. Okay, well maybe if I start talking things will fall silent. I'm not convinced. Anyway, possibly. Hello, good afternoon. What I'm going to do is very simple and very obvious, and covers much less territory than Brian has covered in such an amazingly fluid way. I thought that maybe the most useful contribution I could make to this symposium is to really make the connection between how movies are made and the profession of architecture, because in a sense there is a literally architectural dimension to all filmmaking. All films have production designers. Most production designers are trained as architects. Then they deviate, go into production design. At least that's certainly how it was for most of the last century. Now you can train to be a production designer, but there's still a very strong architectural component in that. And I became interested in this because I got to know one of the great production designers, John Box, and he entrusted me with the task of writing a book, not exactly about his career, but about what production designers do. And I published the book a few years ago, and it kind of got me thinking about and talking to production designers and realizing that production design is something that's missing from most people's conception of a movie. We habitually talk about films as if they were the property, the creation of something called a director. This is a little bit like assuming that the man who stands up in front of, or usually a man, who stands up in front of an orchestra is somehow producing the music. He isn't, of course, he's just keeping the orchestra in order. The music was written by somebody else a long way away, maybe a long time ago, but we tend to identify the performance with the conductor, and we often identify the performance of a film with the director. In fact, some directors, of course, are very important in films, but some are really very unimportant, and the film would get made anyway without them. And also, most of the time when we watch a movie, what are we doing? We're actually watching what the art department has put on the screen. We're watching a few actors too, but most of what we're actually looking at for the time that we watch a film is really what the art department has put there. So I think that the whole question of the design of films, the production design of films, is a very neglected subject. And the more I think about it and talk about it, the more I realize that most people have never really thought much about it. If you ask people to name a production designer, they can only usually come up with one name. Anybody do that? Anybody think of a production designer? Ken Adam. Yes. Is that what you said? That's what everybody says, Ken Adam. He's the only famous production designer in the world. Why? Because he designed half a dozen James Bond films a long time ago, and a few films by Stanley Kubrick, and there are 2 big books about him. So he must be an important production designer. Actually, I don't think he is the most important. He's a very interesting figure in production design, but really he alone has kind of risen to the top of the heap, whereas most people can name 15, 20, 100 directors of films. But how bizarre that production designers have kind of disappeared from the scene. So what I'm trying to do is link that kind of mysterious absence of production design from most people's thinking with a different kind of concept, which I'm calling affective space. Now, just to explain where I'm getting this from, if you look up affective space, you'll find it has many, many different applications and meanings. It's become a growth area in all sorts of disciplines and sub-disciplines recently. People use it in relation to what they call qualitative research. It's used in all sorts of applied social sciences. But I'm using it in really quite a simple way. I'm taking it from D.W. Winnicott, who was a British psychoanalyst who specialized in working with children, who's becoming more and more widely recognized and more widely drawn upon, I think. His most famous book, which you may have come across, is called Playing in Reality. And in that book, he came up with the idea of what he calls a transitional space. That's the space that a child, an infant, first perceives as being not them. And it's the space which is associated with play, with toys and with the space of play. And of course, it's through that experience of playing as an infant that we all get to know the world. We develop a sense of ourselves as different from the world. The world is that which lies outside of us. It's kind of where we start from. And another of Winnicott's books is actually called Home is Where We Start From, which is a wonderful book, which I strongly recommend if you're interested. It started as a series of talks on the radio. So I'm just borrowing this idea from Winnicott of affective space, and I'm trying to apply it in quite simple ways to the business of production design. But let me just give you an example here. You don't have to read all of this. That's how Winnicott's ideas are being taken up by all sorts of theorists working in different fields. And for instance, this is a blurb from the publisher of a recent book who points out that Winnicott's principal concerns are how children and adults bridge the gap between egocentrism and recognition of an external world, how they distinguish between self and other. And this book, this writer, makes a link between Winnicott and Henri Lefebvre, who is somebody that you may have come across. He's, again, widely cited these days, much more widely cited than read, I think. Most people look at his book, The Production of Space, and usually don't finish it. The secret is to read chapter 4. Chapter 4 is the really good bit. But Lefebvre's ideas about the production of space, I think, are also very relevant to thinking about how we can theorize the space that is created for us on screen. So, let me try and apply this very concretely to a film. I'm doing it in relation to Dr. Zhivago because I've just written a book about Dr. Zhivago, but also because the film is on reissue, and it's been playing all around the country in the last month or so and getting lots of new reviews. So in a sense, it's a film that's very old, from 1965, that has suddenly been revived in glorious 4K digital. And so you can actually see a great deal of what's happening in the film in ways that you couldn't if you were just watching it on video or even actually watching it on film, as you might have seen it over the last 50 or 60 years. Now, okay, so where does Dr. Zhivago come from? Well, of course, in one sense, it does, like most films, it comes from a novel. It's a complicated story, which I'm not going to go into, but it is quite an interesting story. It's the only novel that Boris Pasternak ever wrote. He wrote it right at the end of his life, what turned out to be the end of his life. He wrote it under the inspiration of the new lady in his life, Olga, who was there on his left in that photograph. And naively, he thought it could be published in the Soviet Union of the late 50s, but he was wrong. It was banned, very banned indeed, and when he was given the Nobel Prize, offered the Nobel Prize, he had to turn it down because he would never have been able to go back to Russia. A whole flood of books have come out about the Zhivago affair just in the last few years. There are now 3 new books about this extraordinary event that happened at the end of the 1950s. That's one of them over there on the right. It was a very, very, very big bestseller. Everybody who had any pretensions to culture in the world read Dr. Zhivago in the late 50s. That little edition of it right in the middle that you see there is actually the CIA's edition. The CIA went off and printed their own edition of it and smuggled it into Russia, thinking it might help to destabilize Soviet Russia. The best bit is that they handed it out at the Vatican stand at the Brussels Expo, hoping that passing Russians would take it back to Russia. But Zhivago, the novel, is really not the subject of the film. Of course, it comes from the novel, but normally we would say that it's a film by David Lean, great director. That's true. Lean directed it. He devoted nearly 3 years of his life to helping it come about. But I would argue that although Lean's shaping of the film is absolutely crucial, there are some other very important architects of the film who have been rather written out of the picture. One of those is Robert Bolt, who wrote the script. And if you look at the novel and the script, you'll see that they have remarkably little in common. The novel is a huge, rambling structure that occupies decades of Russian history. It's written really in imitation of War and Peace, but it covers a much bigger span. What Robert Bolt did was to make a workable script out of it. He invented scenes, he invented connections, he invented meetings, he invented really everything that we see on screen, using the characters that he'd taken from Boris Pasternak. And I don't say that to belittle either of them, The fact is, this is one of the major achievements in terms of structuring a film through a script, which is quite faithful to the themes of the novel, but totally departs from it in terms of structure. And the other, even more unsung figure who is central to the creation of the film is, I think, John Box. There are very few photographs of most production designers. Production designers do not appear on set. Why? Because they're usually off building the next set. They're not standing around the camera. That's a very rare picture. There are only, I think, 2 pictures that I know of John Box on this film, although he spent nearly 18 months working day and night on it. That already tells you something. He had worked on Lawrence of Arabia, and David Lean had come to trust him very much to do much more than a production designer might do in terms of a few sketches to design the principal sets of the film. This was a real collaboration after what they'd been through on Lawrence, where Box had really saved the film by persuading Lean to leave the desert and go to Seville and shoot all the dramatic scenes of Lawrence of Arabia actually in Spain, in Seville. And in the case of Zhivago, what Box did was very similar, but on a more dramatic scale. Having looked at all the possible countries in which they might shoot Dr. Zhivago, Russia, obviously out of the question, because the book was banned. Yugoslavia, not a good idea. Canada, not a good idea. Finland, etc. They went through a lot of countries before Box came up with the idea, we should make it in Spain. So what's, I think, strikingly interesting about Zhivago is that it's a film entirely constructed from the ground upwards. Not a single shred of it was shot in Russia. Nothing that you see on screen is authentic, and yet the film works very successfully, I think, certainly works very hard to convince you that you're within an entirely fabricated Russia, or rather a not fabricated Russia, a real Russia, a Russia that's perhaps more real than the real Russia. But just before I show you some images, and I'm just going to mainly use stills. If we've got time, I might show you a little bit of moving image, but mainly I'm going to do this with stills. What do I mean by creating effective space on screen? Well, here's an example which does not involve, as it were, anything architectural, really. It's a shot from very near the beginning of the film. The film effectively begins with young Yuri Zhivago seeing his mother buried. We have the funeral. He's wondering what life has in store. He's now an orphan. He's alone. He's afraid. There's a tapping at the window. He comes to the window. There's a tap, 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 tap. The sound is very important. And he looks out, and we see him vignetted through this window. And this is a motif, a visual motif, which is going to be repeated through the film. It's established right in the opening sequence, in the opening scene. It's the idea of a figure looking apprehensively out with a kind of halo which makes the world around them seem indefinite, imprecise. We know in this particular case exactly where this idea came from because, well, I know because I spent a long time talking to John Box. He went on a recce to Finland and he started taking photographs of ice melting on ponds. And he became fascinated by the imagery of the ice melting around a hole. And having photographed it, he decided that it should become a kind of recurrent visual motif in the film. And a lot of key scenes in the film are seen through a window frostily. It becomes one of the ways in which we access the characters and the way we understand their emotions. That's what I would call creating an affective image, an affective space. It's not something we would perhaps notice. We're not supposed to stop and notice it as we watch the film. But we realize by the end of the film, if we stop and reflect on it, that we've actually been affected by this kind of imagery. So the logistics of making the film were formidable. It's one of the great feats of film construction. Having decided to shoot it in Spain, they found a building site outside Madrid, and they created a miniature version of Moscow. It took about a year to build. It's a major piece of construction, very solid, very unlike most film sets. This structure that you see there represented, which became known as Moscow in Madrid, these are real houses. You can actually go in the back as well as in the front. They were built out of building materials, and all of the actors who arrived to work on the film during the course of the year of shooting were astonished to discover that it was functioning like a city. Of course, it's got an interesting relationship to Moscow in two ways. First of all, if you've ever been to Moscow, you'll realize that it bears no relation to Moscow whatsoever. It's like a sort of imagined, a sort of Disneyland Moscow. It's got things that look a bit Moscow-like. But then in 1965, very few people had ever been to Moscow. Very few. It was a mysterious country that you certainly couldn't go and visit easily. And so in a way, this was a film made for people who had never been and probably never would go to the real Moscow. What they were seeing was something which captured the essence of Moscow, certain motifs like the onion domes, the snow, the crenellated wall of the Kremlin and so forth. These are all taken from meticulous research on the real Moscow, but they're deployed in a way quite different. They're compressed, they're made small, and there are really only two streets in this version of Moscow. There's the main street that you see there on the main picture, and then on the side of it there's the working class street, and the little alleyways run between them. And the whole film was structured around the relationship between these two images of Moscow. The other interesting thing about it is that by building a big composite set, as it's called in the business, you could actually start a scene out in the street. You could follow the character, in this case Omar Sharif as Yuri Zhivago, as he goes in the door, up the stairs, round, and he comes here in front of a window, and you see the same set that you just left. This is something which is much treasured by filmmakers and by DPs, by directors of photography, when you can actually show a continuous movement that makes spatial sense to the viewer. And of course it's very expensive, very difficult to do. But in this particular case it was well worth it, because it becomes a kind of foundation element of the film. Now, the most famous construction set in Zhivago is what's called Varikino, the dacha, which is supposed to be out in the country towards the Ural Mountains. I'm sure you've seen this image, the top right-hand image. You must have seen it. There are about 1 million copies of it all over the web. It's much used as a party theme. When Will and Kate had their first party at Kensington Palace, what was the decor they chose? The Ice Palace. So it's become a kind of cliche, certainly a recurrent motif in kind of modern design, decorative design. The interesting thing about it is it's got absolutely no basis in architectural reality. There has never been a dacha in Russia that has onion domes. Any Russian looking at it looks at it and says, but that's impossible. Onion domes are for churches. Why would there be onion domes on a dacha? There aren't. But when you watch the film, you're convinced that this is a possible structure. It's a structure which has developed a life of its own. John Box told me that he got the idea from a postage stamp. He was looking for an idea for this dacha, which is tremendously important in the narrative of the film. He couldn't find an image to design it, and he suddenly saw a postage stamp, and suddenly it came to him, so he designed up this structure, which is built up north in Spain on the basis of that image from a stamp. I've looked for that stamp many times. I've never found it. I'm wondering whether he was pulling my leg. I've found absolutely no original in the years that I've been looking for this image. So perhaps it's something which somehow came out of John Box's imagination. But anyway, we can say it caught on. And I'll say a little bit about the interior in a moment. This is the interior, supposedly, which of course is not the real interior, but is shot in a studio in Madrid. So let me just try and develop this idea of affective space a little bit in relation to some motifs, some themes in the film. So the central idea which Bolt and David Lean fixed on is the relationship between Yuri Zhivago and Lara, the woman he falls in love with. He's not married to her, he's married to another woman, played by Geraldine Chaplin, but the relationship that binds Zhivago and Lara together, Yuri and Lara together, is a kind of great romantic theme that runs through the film. It's present in the novel, but in fact they almost never meet in the novel at all. So the film constructs a series of meetings to give this relationship substance. Otherwise, what would it be? There would be nothing to make it happen on the screen. So for instance, right at the beginning of the film, just after that scene where we've seen young Yuri, who's a medical student, bounding up the stairs, and we look out across the street, just before that happens rather, he's in a tram car, and that image, top left, is in a sense the first meeting between Omar Sharif, Julie Christie, Yuri Zhivago, and Lara. They don't know, of course, they've met. They're sitting in the tram. They're in their own world. We make the connection. It conveys a key idea, which is a notion of fate, that fate is somehow connecting them, although nothing concrete, nothing specific, nothing narrative is yet connecting them. And what the film does at that point is to add a little spark. We suddenly get a shot of the tram car, the arm going along the rail, and it sparks as it comes to a junction, which you might feel as, I sometimes feel, as a rather cheesy way of saying there's something between them. It's a kind of an idea that's planted by a cutaway. But one thing which is absolutely central to the portrayal of Lara is the idea of her being veiled, of her being in some sense hidden, partially hidden from view. It begins in that shot with the big scarf wrapped across half of her face. It's picked up a little bit later when Rod Steiger, Komorowski, eyes her up as his next conquest, and he trails a scarf across her face. And it's continued in some later scenes when there's a crisis between Lara, Julie Christie, and her husband. She's married to the character played by Tom Courtenay. We only see them through a window. This is another of these strange window shots. We see them as if from outside in a very, very elaborate shot, which took a lot of doing to give us a kind of filtered, veiled view. We don't hear what they're saying, we just know that it's an intense, life-changing relationship between them. And this is another great moment in the film where Yuri first sees Lara, actually. He sees her as a disembodied arm. And then the lights are turned on and he sees the rest of her. And this shot, David Lean considered to be probably the best shot in the film. He wrote to the cameraman and said, that's a masterpiece of lighting and of construction. Why is it such a masterpiece? Because it's mysterious, because it withholds, because it creates a sense of expectation, and also it underlines this notion of fate that has been planted at the beginning. I'm not going to say too much about the color plot of the film, although it's very important, but that's a whole separate kind of subject. There's a very important series of color images running through the film which center on the notion of yellow sunflowers, yellow, that's frost on the window at the top left, and we see a field of daffodils, and suddenly Yuri, having lost track of Lara, rediscovers her when, after the revolution, when they've moved to the country, and this is the great scene at the top there where he first sees her in a library in Yuriatin. But the reason I'm showing you this slide is because of this space. This is a very unspectacular space. It's Lara's apartment in a little two-bit town, Yuriatin, where she has found refuge after the revolution. And what's interesting about it is its very nondescriptness compared with the other constructions that we've seen, Moscow, the Ice Palace. This is, as it were, a domestic space which is deliberately unspectacular. It's not stylish, it's not stylized in any way. It represents something very important for the character because it represents a domesticated space, a home-like space, amidst the upheavals of the First World War, followed by the Revolution, which have completely destroyed their lives. So I would argue that the space here is doing the emotional work of the sequence, much more than the characters are. What actually passes between Yuri and Lara when they reach this space is very inconsequential. But actually what's doing the work for us is this sense of a domestic space, a safe haven, which they've reached. And I think I can actually show you that sequence. Have we? Well, I think we've got enough time to do that, so let's run the risk of... okay. Let me just take that down, and with a bit of luck, I've got, I hope, have we got sound running on this at the moment? I'm wondering. No, we haven't.
We have to go somewhere.
Here! I came here to find my husband. One was reported killed.
Don't go. I met him.
Met him?
Yes.
So, there you see how that space becomes, in many ways, the climax, the apotheosis of this very important turning point in the film, which works by turning away from the spectacular visual effects that have dominated the film up to this point, and some of them have been very spectacular indeed, and turning towards almost the exact reverse, which is a deliberately drab, de-dramatized, but heavily domesticated space. And I think that plays a hugely important part in the emotional plot of the film. And this is what it's set against. It's set against a conscious, very elaborate attempt to convey the vastness of Russia. And that's vastness in a geographical sense. The film has to give us a sense of the epic backdrop of Russia, the huge distances, etc., which it does in scenes like this, where there's an enormous emphasis on drama, distance, landscape, etc. Mountains, which we see right at the beginning. The whole of after the transition from World War I to the Revolution is entirely conducted along this road. Again, it's a spatial device by creating a road down which two groups of soldiers march, and by what happens between the two groups of soldiers, we understand, as it were, something which is not in the novel at all, because the novel never really refers to the First World War or much to the Revolution. It sort of jumps over that, but we have to see it to understand what's driven a wedge into Russian society, and this is where it's staged, in this wide open space with little smudges of snow. And the end of the film, the very penultimate scene of the film, is set against this extraordinary visual representation of Russia in the Stalin years. Again, it's not something that's ever portrayed in this way in the novel. The figure called Lara simply disappears in the novel. We don't know what's happened to her, really. But in the film, that idea of disappearing into the gulag, into the anonymity of Stalin's Russia, is conveyed through an extraordinary image where a highly implausible, giant-sized image of the face of Stalin is plonked on the wall, and the figure of Julie Christie simply walks out of shot. And that stands for the whole idea of disappearance. It's a very bold, very interesting stroke. And just to recap on that idea of the other kinds of spaces, here are some examples. Here, for instance, is the space that you've just seen, the house at Yuryatin, bottom right there, which is just animated, just punctuated by the appearance of those sunflowers that have run through the film. And these are the two of the shots in the very short sequence where Yuri and Lara escape from Yuryatin, go to Varikino, to the onion-domed dacha, and it's here that they consummate their love, as it were, in a very short space of time, domestic time, and it's here that Yuri gets back to being a poet, which is what is supposed to have brought him fame and immortality, and he sits and writes a series of poems in this scene. And again, you can see how these spaces have been very, very carefully constructed, emptied of detail in a way, toned down, muted in terms of their color palette, simplified in all sorts of ways to make sure that they leave us with a strong emotional residue. And this, I think, is what's going on as we work our way through the film, as we experience the film on an emotional level. This is a film which has had a huge impact on people. It's one of the most cherished of films. I didn't realize this when I started writing my book, but I started mentioning it to people And the number of people of all ages who said, oh, it's my favorite film, is astonishing. There are more messages on message board and IMDb for this than for almost any other film of its era. It has an astonishing kind of reach, and it's mainly an emotional reach. Most people, if you press them as to why the film is important to them or interesting or why they remember it, it's because of its emotional impact. So I've been trying to get to grips with what creates this emotional impact. And my argument is that it's not just the characters, not just the actors, Omar Sharif, Julie Christie. Surprisingly, it's the actual world that was constructed by John Box and the DPs and orchestrated, conducted by David Lean. That's all. Thank you.
My topic sounds a bit unwieldy, discontinuity and the fragmentary in architecture and film. I think it's one of the most interesting and pervasive and distinctive aspects of modernism, not only in architecture and film, but across all the arts. You could mount a big argument in which you traced it across culture, which obviously isn't feasible in 30 minutes. So I picked a couple very striking, extreme examples in both architecture and film that demonstrate the peculiar characteristics of this as a deliberately chosen motif. So the first film is Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera. I'm sure that someone has done a study in which they point out exactly how much of the 68 minutes of this film is shot with a moving camera and how much of it is shot with a stationary camera. Sadly, we're going to be stuck with stills. I was convinced years ago that I shouldn't mess with moving images in lectures, that I can't, there's a complexity about it that Brian is totally on top of and that defeated me the one time I tried it. Anyway, this is a film about movement. This conceives the city as flux and change. Even buildings are made to be changing continually, opening their shutters, flexing their lifts, rotating their doors. It's pervasive in the film. The means of movement, trams, trains, horse-drawn carts, are a tremendous focus. And one of the great absurdities of doing it all in stills is that Vertov's name involves or encapsulates movement. It isn't his real name. His name was David Kaufman. He rechristened himself Diga Vertov, which I take other people's word for it, means spinning top. I tried to look this up in Russian and Ukrainian dictionaries, and I got absolutely nowhere. Probably someone afterward can explain to me how you get from Ziga Vertov to recognizable Russian words. But anyway, that's what this name is taken to move and that to mean. And that's what this film director chooses as a badge, that he embodies this particular property. Well, it's not just one, of this peculiar, unstable, and revolutionary art. The trams that are such a feature are slipping past each other, are crossing each other's paths, are in a wonderful kind of fluid, but obviously artificial constructed motion. Vertov is not averse to speeding up the film. There are lots of passages in which people are racing even faster because of the film being shown at unnatural speed. The figure in this shot that you're looking at isn't a random passerby, he's the cameraman, and happens to be Vertov's brother. And this person is an actor in the film, is a character, is not a constant but a regularly recurrent presence in the film. So the camera and the cameraman are really there in a way that the funny title, the very unappealing to me title of this film suggests that they will be. This is one of the very few moments when you see him stationary in a world that is moving on all sides around him. Anytime that you're looking at the cameraman and seeing film being made, someone else must be filming that happening. And I don't think that you ever see that second team in the film. But probably there's a moment in which the cameraman turns his camera on the people behind him. And that becomes, because Vertov is absolutely far from averse, he's extremely welcoming to the idea of your sensing this as something that occurs in a peculiar way and isn't somehow arising by magic. Well, the cameraman, as an actor in the film, appears in sequences like this, which I think, because it's taken out of context and doesn't show the horse, for example, who will soon appear to the left, is hard to guess in what you have in front of you. But this is a moving car and a moving horse cart, and they're moving in parallel but not perfectly synchronized. So here you have these two motions, and they're slightly fighting with each other. I think that we're in Kiev. The reason I think this is that I've also read that the railway station from which we saw these people in the carriage take off is recognizably Kiev railway station. The reason I go to the trouble to pin this down, I couldn't do it if I was asked to for the film as a whole, is that I always thought of this as taking place in Moscow. But it doesn't take place in one city. It takes place in a kind of composite city that's at least three: Kharkov, Kiev, Moscow. And there are even little glimpses of Odessa. So this film is an urban collage in more than one way, in that it shows a composite reality that involves geographical distance, but also a composite reality in that it shows the same moment in the day in different aspects. A girl waking up, a street waking up, turning points in lives. Some in the lives of characters that we see, some people who we will never see again. Birth, there's a famous and rather vivid delivery of a baby. Funerals, weddings, and also, interestingly, divorces. So it's an encyclopedia in the form of a collage that really covers an unbelievable number of separate activities. The thing about the disjunction and confusion of different experiences brought momentarily and glancingly and not at all consecutively together is that the attitude is welcoming, optimistic, enthusiastic, not lamenting that things fall apart and the center cannot hold. Quite the opposite. Oh, it doesn't want. I can't get it to show the next one. I must have. Great, thanks. So here's a building, a would-be building. It never existed. It never got off the drawing board. But it's, to me, a fascinating example of an architect trying to imagine a building that's flying apart, or something that is completely unstable, inspired by the centrifugal tendencies of film, perhaps. It's a newspaper kiosk in a place where things are not standing still, where events are just sweeping over you. Rodchenko, who designed this, wasn't, of course, mainly an architect, but a graphic artist. But in the moment in Soviet history that we're looking at, these identities were not fixed. That is, that all artists were impatient with galleries as places for their work to be confined and restricted, and were anxious to get themselves out in the street where they would take part in the kind of social commotion that was going on. What? Can I use this? Yes, you could. Oh. But it doesn't work. Ah, there. A wonderful example, I think. I'll tell you something. I am looking at a stretch version of this picture, which I find really quite horrible. But you're not. You're looking at one that's properly proportioned. This is really one of my favorite buildings. It doesn't exist anymore. It was temporary. It was built for an agricultural exhibition and designed by an architect named Melnikov, who may be familiar to her from an amazing house that he built for himself in a time when he couldn't get other commissions. But anyway, here is a temporary building built in these crude materials, and built in a really rough and ready way by uneducated, I was going to say peasants. I don't know that that's really the right word for it. But there is a kind of dynamic tension in the way these ill-assorted elements are combined that is like a kind of movement. And the dynamism of this building is really something special and not repeated anywhere else, I think. It looks like a kit that actually moves. In a way, the Korb example, this is a studio that Korb built around the same time that Melnikov was building his pavilion. as a house studio for his friend, the painter Ausenfant. In a way, the Korb is more outrageous because of the blatant conjunction of the cool precision and the nakedness of this concept that also envisages the building as machine-like, as looking as if it might have moving parts, as if the spiral stair might actually do something. But I find the dynamism in the Melnikoff building much more wild and imaginative than the Korb, really. By a strange coincidence, at the same time that more or less the Korb was building that, Villa Melnikoff was building in Paris, was building the Soviet Pavilion for the Decorative Arts exhibition, and has created a really cinematic composition with its suggestions of segmented motion, with its panning across expansive scenes, with its cutting back and forth between opposing masses, and with something like montage between unlikely combinations that create some new hybrid. This, from 50 years later, has a superficial resemblance to the last example in its exploding forms, in the feeling that you have that the different parts of the building are trying to get away from each other, and in the impromptu materials and the much rougher mode of construction than you expect. This is Frank Gehry's house in Santa Monica, built in the 70s. And it shares a lot, but instead of the optimism of the Soviet examples, there's a kind of angst. And there are various possible explanations of where this comes from and what it means. Is it a crisis in the family? Is it a moment in the cultural history of Los Angeles, or possibly the suburb in general? Or, as people have even suggested, more far-fetched, is it making reference to the Holocaust? Well, this slide just shows these materials fleeing from each other, exploding out of the form. It's quite important, of course, that this is a pre-existing, quite ordinary house in a street full of similar houses, and that Gehry is just making this house do things that it never thought of doing before, and that are quite alien to the environment in which it's doing them. But the idea is that there's some deeper truth in this kind of discontinuous and fragmentary representation of space than in the more sober ones on either side. This is a Gehry proposal for a rather large family house, an unexecuted house, a model. Part of the explanation of why it seems both more composed and more uneasy, but at this time in his career, Gehry was turning those strange gestures and impulses that erupt in the Santa Monica house of his own into a sort of formalized vocabulary, and the what seemed really in some ways out of nowhere and spontaneous, was becoming a style that you could give a name to and that could repeat itself in variations in other locations. Another example of Corb's, from Corb's Villa Savoie of 1929, Corb's way of describing these always uses utopian language. Other people have seen a kind of surrealist bleakness in this. Actually, the one I'm looking at doesn't have the exaggerated spatial recession like a rapid movement in a film that seems hardly containable by domestic space, so that you feel as if somehow some force that really belongs outdoors has been brought indoors. I don't think either that the dismemberment of the building, I mean taking off its roof, puncturing its walls, these don't feel like comfortable windows. They feel more like strips of film that could go on until they did serious disruption. Well, the hinge that I'm hoping to use to tie together the two examples that are my main examples of films expressing the discontinuous, fragmented vision, which are 70 years apart, Vertov in 1929 and Christopher Nolan's Memento of 2000. The hinge that I'm hoping to use is the road movie. The road movie which takes the journey as the form for the work of art, that is a kind of placelessness or an unfixed and fluid place that goes through a bunch of possibly disconnected changes. The particular example I've chosen is a kind of rogue example. It's a film of 1962 by Satyajit Ray. I read in some place how you should pronounce Satyajit Ray, something like that. But anyway, it's a wonderful film, I think. It's very peculiar in that it plants this protagonist who's a taxi driver, a common kind of protagonist in films for some obvious reasons. It plants him in a very backward location. So here this person is performing a sort of up-to-date or modern function in a traditional place. And yet, in spite of all this local color, like these very colorful passengers that he's taking to catch a train, in spite of that, it's really another story of modern alienation. And the senselessness of the conjunction of these people who don't belong together on this errand that has no roots is a entirely functional and temporary and in some sense deprived of meaning. That sort of violates the idea of the road as a place of freedom, as at the very least a neutral space. Well, it turns out not to be. It turns out to be a place where all the old humiliations and threats are present and oppressive and finally defeat the protagonist. So my last example, Memento, it isn't, strictly speaking, a road movie, but it does almost qualify in that it takes place in a kind of nowhere. You can't really identify what town it's in. Somewhere in California, I think. If you go by the license plates, the protagonist's license plate is a Nevada license plate. So that's more or less where it is. But you're not meant to know where it is. You're not meant really to recognize the places except generically. Almost all of it takes place either in motel rooms or in cars. And there's something uncanny about some of these spaces. These exterior corridors down which this person goes quite frequently, back and forth, that just feel like the locations of perpetual surveillance. The room itself, where the main activities are talking on the telephone to unidentified listeners and shuffling through documents. And as you have probably noticed, it's black and white, and there's a strange punctuation. There are these episodes in black and white that come regularly between episodes in color. It's very much broken into episodes. The meaning of the black and white, well, you don't exactly understand what it's for, but it seems like it's pretty sober. He's mostly just sitting there. And that it's a kind of objectivity, that it's a chance to get closer to the truth. Well, the really special feature of this film is that the protagonist suffers from a kind of amnesia that makes it impossible for him to make new memories. He can't really deal with experience as it unfolds because it slips away instantly. There is a kind of cutoff point. He does remember his life up to the moment of the murder of his wife. And the film is a sort of perverted or twisted example of a detective film. He's looking for the killer. He can't remember what he's found out that might help him in his search unless he writes it down. So he makes lots of notes, but he also decides that the place these notes belong is on him, that he will write it all out on himself. Here is an example both of the sort of triviality and uselessness of some of these notes and the amazing variety of scripts in which they are written. I think that this motif is probably partly inspired by Kafka's story, The Penal Colony, which you might remember describes particularly horrible punishments that involve writing the sentence that the person has been given after being judged guilty on the body of the prisoner in such beautifully elaborate script that it practically takes up the entire space. It might be a very brief judgment, like I think I remember correctly that one of the judgments is be just. But these letters are elaborated into an indescribably complex form until they cover the entire surface. The sentence is administered in a strange machine that rotates the body when necessary in order for the inscription to go the whole way round. Anyway, I think the point of it in this film is that learning is painful, that learning is even punishment, and you see him inscribing himself, and it's nothing's left out in the ugliness and bloodiness of it. And of course, partly he's written on by other people. The things printed in reverse were not done by the recipient himself. But I'm spending more time on this particular motif, which is perhaps the most dodgy element in the film, and yet I think the filmmaker probably takes it very seriously, and is even imagining things about the origins of writing being connected with the survival of memories or of culture's ability to record themselves. But of course, that's all fine applied to culture. The individual doesn't benefit in the same way from writing as an aid to memory. Anyway, here is the last scene of the film, or rather the first scene. That's the devilish thing about the film. It begins and ends in the same place, which is this abandoned industrial site. And the way that we cope with the problem of not being able to remember is to divide experience up into sort of dissociated chunks that are then presented to you in what is clearly not chronological order. You can't tell exactly what order it is unless it's reversed chronological order. They don't add up, these chunks, they just kind of congregate. And here we're the scene at the other end of the movie in the same place, looking in the other direction. Doesn't solve the riddle, doesn't solve it by any manner of means. The technique for getting into this consciousness, for representing to ourselves this shattered experience of the world, is to divide the linear narrative into a series of rather short segments to make the last moments of segment A form the first moments of segment B, so that little suture is repeated, is shown twice. Of course, because the things are all reversed, B comes before A. So you get the end of A, and then B, and then you get A, and at the end, you get the end of A again. And you realize that you've seen it before. But how do you make sense of this? It's very confusing. I don't know if my description has made it sound even conceivable. It definitely makes you feel that you're being manipulated, but I can only say that in some funny way it is compelling. And at the same time, it feels like it is, in a very funny way, true. But there you are, and it remains uncomfortable. I suppose that you know, well, you don't know who killed his wife. You don't know that there was a murder. You can't be certain that even that actually happened. But the best you can say probably is that you understand just exactly the way in which he went wrong in his search, in his attempt to so anyway, the architectural instances that I've thought of are, first of all, the Soane Museum in London, which is a space composed of memories, but memories which are not in chronological order, which would be very tedious to, in fact, put into the nearest thing to chronological order. A place with more than one abyss opening up beneath you, a building that is dismembering itself in ways that are quite unsettling, really, at times. A place that is itself a kind of antiquity and a kind of complicated flashback, where memory is discontinuous and doesn't unroll smoothly at any time. This is a work that may be familiar to some of you. It's an actual destruction, not an illusion like Soane's so many examples of a building that's been sliced at and made to appear as if it's opening up and losing its solidity. This is Gordon Matta Clark's surgery on a condemned building. That's where most of his work takes place, in buildings scheduled for demolition. And that's why none of them survived, none of them, except in kind of silly fragments or in these very powerful photos and videos. The video of the creation and destruction of this conical intersect, as it's called, in a townhouse in Paris is really incredibly powerful. I wish I could show it, but I can't. But anyway, looking at it in the context of this particular argument made me feel that one of the great beauties of the Matta Clark, what do you call it, renovation of this building, is that these rough edges come to have the properties of a sketch. They make it feel more like the concept purely displayed. And there's a wonderful teetering between creation and destruction. You can feel that there's a mind at work, and you can also feel that there's a powerful annihilating urge in the person who's doing this. He did study to be an architect, but he wasn't really interested in practicing traditional architecture. I'm not sure that I even remember his word for something that would be against architecture and would be a kind of unarchitecture. He made up a kind of expression. This is the external reality of what we were just looking at in the previous slide. There's the hole in the building as it appears from the street. This is a 17th century townhouse in a particular location in Paris next to the Pompidou Center, which was created at the same time that the Pompidou was going up. So it forms, Mata Clark's destruction forms just a small part of a general destruction of a much bigger area of the city. And that gives it a different meaning or cultural setting from most of Mata Clark's work. Well, I've got just a few images of a film by a Chinese filmmaker from 10 years ago, a Chinese filmmaker named Wang Bing, a film called West of the Tracks, which is about the destruction of a whole district. These are the workers leaving for the last time. They won't be back, and these factories won't be there much longer. This is a beautiful overview before the destruction of this strange district on the edge of a large Chinese city, a kind of suburb whose name is actually West of the Tracks. That's the English translation of the territory's name. But anyway, the film just shows the complete disassembly, the taking apart of something that begins by being whole. It does make me think of the current story of London, where a sort of senseless collage of high buildings, which can only be kept straight by giving them derisive nicknames like cheese grater, walkie-talkie, shard, and at the same time, zones of gigantic dwellings that are not really dwellings, that are investments that have escaped from the bank and got out there where they can usurp public space. So it seems like this theme has come horribly alive again in reality. I noticed that a couple other people said that's the end of my lecture, and I have always had this problem that I did have to say that the lecture was over at this point.
Antonioni has always been a source of pleasure. He draws art and life together in a wonderful way. What is it about him that makes one so aware of simply being alive? In some way, the time of our living becomes part of the time of the film. So, to go over his films quickly, L'Avventura, with Gabriele Ferzetti and Monica Vitti, we saw her just now, where in the end one doesn't know who's been lost and who's been found. Ambiguity writ large. The party of socialites on an outing search the rocky island in an amateurish, disjointed way, and occasionally calling, Anna, Anna. La Notte, with Marcello Marchione and Jeanne Moreau. It was marvelous to see Jeanne Moreau again with her downturned mouth, where the conversations and the events seem utterly disconnected from each other. We went to L'Eclisse at the National Film Theatre, enjoyed Monica Vita and the whole Antonioni thing, the wind in the branches, the paper in the tub of water, the thingness of things. The Red Desert, the first film he made in colour, 1964, where a huge hull suddenly fills the back of the screen with no comment from anyone. Blow Up, with David Hemmings and Vanessa Redgrave, 1967, where the more the image is blown up, he enlarges the image, the less it tells us of what was there. Ambiguity again. The Wind in the Trees continues on and on, so different from Hollywood films, where everything lasts just long enough to tell the story. The last one we saw was The Passenger, with Jack Nicholson and Mary Schneider in August 2006, and we found it incredibly touching and moving. Perhaps he makes us simply slow down so that we live in the time of the film. Art has taken over life. It's worth thinking about this in some detail. For instance, what happens to the rhetoric? What exactly is the rhetoric in Antonioni? In writing, rhetoric is essential for communication to take place. It constitutes the shared part of language, and it exists also as part of ordinary life, as part of everyday conversation. Charles Drenk speaks of unavoidable rhetoric. Rhetoric is as old as language. Greek or Roman senators had to be adept at the speech that changed the course of events by inspiring the soldiers or by calming the populace. They studied rhetoric at school and aspired to eloquence, but eloquence was registered only when it resulted in the right action. Shakespeare plays marvelous games with this in his historical dramas. Think of the speech in Julius Caesar, where Mark Antony reverses the behavior of the Roman mob, at first exulting in Caesar's death, then baying for the blood of his murderers. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. He goes on to praise Caesar, not to bury him, a complete reversal of his pretended motives. His weapon is rhetoric. Rhetoric is language used to persuade. Attempts have been made to escape rhetoric, notably by the Smithsons with their book Without Rhetoric Towards an Architecture of Aesthetic. It seemed that their best example of avoiding rhetoric was the Chase Manhattan Bank, which to me breathes the rhetoric of big corporations. I tried to discuss this issue with Peter, but he wouldn't listen. He refused the very idea of semiology, which is the scientific study of language. According to Roland Barthes, a hero of mine, only poetry escapes rhetoric. And perhaps Antonioni is so poetic that he simply escapes it, period. Perhaps that's why so much of his writing seems disconnected. In poetry, the attempt to achieve this sometimes results in a complete failure of information or communication. Perhaps there develops an intermediate stage where the rhetoric of poetry is being extended. Certainly poetry often contains a lot of ambiguity. In film, even when the attempt is to be realistic, rhetoric is usually brought back in by way of the music. In watching your favorite soap opera, try cutting out the sound and see how empty the action becomes. It applies to almost everything one sees on the box. One soon realizes that, for the most part, it is the background music, so-called, that supplies the feeling. I once asked Marguerite Duras, at the presentation of her movies at the National Film Theatre, what part music played in her long, slow scenes where nothing much happens. And we seem to be watching life, not a film. Music is absolutely essential, she replied. In Duras' films, music is part of the discourse, even when it is quite raucous, which it usually is, it poeticizes the scene. And that's why she considered it essential. For the most part, it doesn't exist in that way in real life, although it can be a part of what's being shot, as with scenes in a nightclub, for example, and so a legitimate part of the unrolling scene before us. In films, there is sometimes an awkward moment when this music is succeeded by the more continuous background music that expresses the feelings we are intended to feel. The transition is usually marked by a silence, but in everyday life that we live, there is no background music. We are on our own. The Belgian filmmaker Chantal Akerman has a marvelous sequence in one of her movies. I think it's Les Résidences d'Anna, 1976. The camera never moves. It's focused on the stairs down leading out from a railway platform. Silence. Just an occasional loiterer. Then, the noise of an approaching train. It grows louder and louder, and we glimpse it stopping on the right. Then, a melee of people pushing and shoving each other on the way down the steps in real time. No music. Time has the same measure in life and in the film. We're experiencing real life. By projecting the real life scene in the framework of an art movie, she succeeds in imbuing reality with an ideological intensity of rendering it poetic. In another of her hymns, News from Home, 1976, we see long shots of the city viewed as if for the first time. The soundtrack is an entirely separate experience, consisting only of Ackerman reading letters from her mother still back home. The contrast between the views of an indifferent city and the intimacy of the letters, that's the story. With Antonioni, it's different. He uses background music, but only occasionally. In L'Avventura, for instance, we are almost halfway through the film before some background music is heard. But there's always the soundtrack, and it contains very accurately the sounds that belong to the scene unrolling. The rattle of a passing train, the plops made by drops of water, wind and trees with a different sound from wind and grass, very accurate. The background noise takes the place of background music. In the final scene of L'Avventura, where Sandro, after a declaration of his love for her, has betrayed Claudia with a chance contact in the dining room of the hotel, we see him leaving the prostitute money. One is aware of something very like rhetoric in the way that Claudia, clearly despairing, approaches him, sees him that he is weeping, gently touches him, and attempts reconciliation, all without a word being spoken. Actions speak louder than words. I think Antonioni is suspicious of words. He wants to escape from words. That's why so many of his conversations seem disjointed. He makes them sound like background noise. He wants to question the power of words. For him, words are often lies. True emotions are beyond words. It's almost as if words have become themselves the background music, often disconnected from the characters. I think that's why one is so aware of ambiguity in his films. Ambiguity, along with irony, is an ingredient of mannerism. Mannerism was a Renaissance century art form which everybody confused with the classical, but it was subvertive of the classical. Perhaps in in Antonioni too, as in James Stirling, is what Colin Rowe called another mannerist, a modern mannerist. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. That's a unique introduction. And thank you to Brian and to Jamie and everyone else who's been involved in organising today. It's a particular pleasure for me to be involved in an event like this, especially with such an interesting and distinguished range of speakers. I'm going to talk today about some ideas that feature in my book, The Architecture of David Lynch, and I hope that, as well as offering some specific thoughts on how Lynch's career has engaged with architecture and urban design, it might also ask us some broader questions about what it means to think about a filmmaker's career as a kind of architectural project, a project that might make us think again about the kinds of knowledge and learning that we look for in both cinema and architecture. The book is premised on a belief that, assessed as a whole, Lynch's films constitute a distinctive, provocative history of modern architecture and urban design. And this is a history that runs from London in the 1880s, as Lynch showed us in The Elephant Man, which is a vision of the Victorian city that uses locations in Shad Thames and Wapping and Liverpool Street. Thanks to Lost Highway, Lynch's history is one that considers the influence of modernist domestic design, its impact on our notions of surveillance and privacy, and how these architectural forms evolved in translation from Central Europe to Southern California. So, for example, the book considers Lynch's cinematic homes alongside domestic designs by the likes of Adolf Loos and Richard Neutra. And if you take this Viennese bedroom that Loos designed for his wife in 1903, I think that the curtain backdrop and the thick rug here are both sensuous and sinister, and we might add very Lynchian. And actually, Brian, you asked earlier what you thought, you were interested in what Loos thought about film, where he was a very keen film critic and he wrote about film. Lynch's history of architecture and design is especially concerned with the materials and forms of post-1945 America. He's interested in the impact of various media devices on domestic life. We can think again here of Lost Highway. And he emphasizes the temporal slippages which have been involved in design across recent decades. So you might think here about how Blue Velvet or Twin Peaks bring the 1950s and the 1980s into close dialogue. The decline of downtown districts in post-war America is also a key concern for Lynch, as I'll discuss in greater detail with regard to Eraserhead. And the growth of the national highway system offers Lynch great potential in terms of the road movie, as Wild at Heart shows us. Finally, Lynch's history of architecture and design is one that leads right up to the present day, to Los Angeles, as we see in Mulholland Drive and Inland Empire, though in Lynch's eyes, LA is a city haunted by its past. I'm going to focus particularly today on Lynch's urban environments, on the dark and hidden spaces in his towns and cities, on these forgotten or misremembered spaces that his camera loves to explore, a distorted and somewhat askew passage that we might call the alley behind the marketplace. And I hope in particular this urban focus on Lynch might feel somewhat refreshing, because Lynch is so often thought of as a director who's principally interested in small town America, in white picket fences and green lawns. But contrary to this belief, Lynch has been as much a director of the big city as he has the small town or suburb. And in thinking about Lynch's response to urban sites in both Europe and the US, I'm going to offer some specific readings of three of his most interesting films: Eraserhead, Mulholland Drive, and Inland Empire. Before that, though, I thought it might be worth noting how contemporary architects have themselves engaged with Lynch's work. Brian argued very persuasively at the start of today about why architects should watch movies, and I think it's clear that architects have certainly been watching David Lynch's films. Peter Eisenman, for example, has written about Blue Velvet, and in 1991 he suggested to quote, "All our lives are spent learning how to get it, Lynch unlearns us." All our lives are spent learning how to get it, Lynch unlearns us. What a tremendously interesting response. How would a process of unlearning take place? What kinds of architectural thinking do Lynch's films affirm or disavow? Or if we're not seeking how to get it, which in Lynch's case might mean abandoning attempts to solve these films, then what else might we discover in watching them? I think these are some questions for us to keep in mind. As well as Eisenman's interest in Lynch, Frank Gehry has been directly inspired by him as well. In 2009, Gehry designed this as yet unrealized project for a cultural center in the Polish city of Łódź. And these indicative designs that you see here feature images from Lynch's inland empire projected onto the side of the building. Now, Gehry's design seems to suggest that there may be a connection between the jarring, complex narrative of Lynch's film and his own congregation of abstract, interlocking forms. Although, as I'll suggest at the end of today, things might be a little bit more complicated than that. In addition, Jean Nouvel has designed 2 rooms directly inspired by Lost Highway inside a hotel he designed in Lucerne in Switzerland. And here, as you can see, a still from Lost Highway adorns the ceiling above the bed. And I think we can only imagine what kind of dreams a Lynchian hotel room might inspire. So perhaps we can say that Gehry and Nouvel have been learning or even unlearning from Lynch. And this might encourage us to think about why this particular filmmaker's work seems to resonate with so many contemporary architects. So let's take a closer look at the Lynchian city. First, consider Eraserhead, which was Lynch's cinematic debut from 1977. And it's a film that Lynch himself has often described as being, to quote, the real Philadelphia story. Historically, Philadelphia has been amongst the most prosperous cities in the United States. It was a pioneer of sophisticated urban infrastructure in the 18th and 19th centuries, when it was America's leading industrial base. But by the time Lynch moved to Philadelphia in 1965, things had changed dramatically. Lynch lived with his young family in Callow Hill, which is an area just north of downtown that has been especially affected by Philadelphia's post-war manufacturing slump. Since leaving Philadelphia, Lynch has described the city as, and this is a direct quote, a very sick, degenerate, decaying, fear-ridden place where things are totally absurd and confusing. Interestingly, though, Lynch felt an excitement while he lived there in the 60s. He says, "I saw things that were frightening, but more than that, thrilling." 40 years after Lynch left Philadelphia, Callow Hill remains an assortment of industrial detritus and railway infrastructure where isolated homes and abandoned warehouses sit alongside parking lots and auto repair shops. It maintains a feeling of desolation and poverty, lined with the remnants of glorious Art Deco hotels and factories. The transformation of several of these buildings into upscale apartment blocks has also placed Callow Hill at the center of gentrification debates in Philadelphia. The area is brimming with fertile decay, just like Łódź in downtown LA, as we'll discover soon. This is the kind of ill-defined terrain that sparks Lynch's imagination. And fittingly, the area now enjoys a new nickname. Locals call it the Eraserhood. Eraserhead begins with Henry Spencer's lonely walk through the wastelands of post-war Philadelphia. This is the American industrial city at its lowest point. Amidst the blank facades and broken windows, Henry appears to be Philadelphia's last inhabitant. And while Bob was just talking, I was thinking about Antonioni and those blank facades, and thinking there might be a kind of dialogue that Lynch is setting up here. And then Bob, when you talked about Antonioni being suspicious of words, I think this is also something that applies to Lynch, and maybe something that these blank facades also speak to. In the opening moments of Eraserhead, Lynch uses a series of lengthy shots featuring little or no camera movement to create this ghostly and alienating urban stage. This is a stagnating city suffering from reproductive failures, a place which speaks to a generation of Rust Belt decline across the East Coast. The rest of the film elaborates on these malfunctioning manufacturing processes. Strange pipes and mounds of earth emerge in the city, and a mutant baby is born. The film's confusion, fear, and hesitancy indicate anxiety concerning a particular form of East Coast urbanism. It seems to be an unease about the proximity of industrial and human production. Here, I think, we might turn to the work of Edward Dimmenberg, who has explored film noir in the context of the centrifugal forces that devastated post-war urban America. Dimmenberg sees film noir as both a celebration and a mourning of centripetal space, specifically downtown America. He claims that noir functions, to quote, as a social memory bank, something that provides a means for the film spectator to remember disappearing urban forces. I think if we extend Dimmenberg's conclusions from film noir to Eraserhead, this allows us to see Lynch's vision of Philadelphia also as a kind of social memory bank. Lynch shows us America's iconic industrial city in a distinct identity crisis, a period of limbo between manufacturing success and the narratives of gentrification and post-industrialism that would dominate urban theory from the late 70s onwards. It's a moment, we might say, when Philadelphia found itself in the alley behind the marketplace. We could view Henry as a pioneer of the warehouse lifestyles which are now emerging in Callow Hill, but I think the contemporary preference for cleansed industrial spaces sees only irony where Lynch senses uncanny remnants. And yet, Lynch's vision of urban decline has also ensured a kind of immortality for Callow Hill rather than cultural erasure. Eraserhead is now memorialised, for example, on the side of this art gallery in the Eraser Hood. There's a final irony to this tale. Eraserhead was shot entirely in Los Angeles. Lynch's vision of East Coast gloom was created in the sunshine of California. Like so many urban fictions, Lynch's Philadelphia was a product of exile and an exercise in imaginary architecture. And I'm thinking here of a comparison with what Ian talked about with Moscow in Madrid with Dr. Zhivago. Indeed, in a perfect example of America's shifting urban priorities, the abandoned oil well near West Hollywood that was used by Lynch to recreate Philadelphia has now itself been erased by this enormous Beverly Center shopping mall. Thus, Eraserhead's production history brings to light what has been won and lost in America's regeneration battles. The landscape that helped recreate a frightening but thrilling city has been supplanted by a banal space of consumerism. As Lynch himself notes, the instruments of production and manufacturing have become, to quote, a congestion of shops and parking and lights and signs. Ironically enough, the ongoing efforts to diversify Philadelphia's economy after its manufacturing decline include significant government incentives designed to encourage filmmakers to use the city as a location. It's almost as if the reproduction of images may be one form of urban manufacturing with a sunny future. Let's turn now to a film both set and shot in Los Angeles, Mulholland Drive, released in 2001. Notably, it's downtown Los Angeles that captured Lynch's attention. Historically, downtown LA has, of course, been much maligned. Famously, when Rainer Banham wrote about Los Angeles in the 1970s, he gave downtown LA just a note in his book because he said that's all downtown LA deserves. It was for Rainer Banham a place of sheer irrelevance compared with the rest of the city. Lynch, though, clearly does not agree. In fact, he gives downtown a starring role in Mulholland Drive. He shows us the area's Art Deco office blocks and glistening skyscrapers, as well as the tight grid they stand within. But it's downtown's role in movie history that really grabs him. At the heart of Mulholland Drive, Lynch takes us downtown to perhaps the most memorable scene in his entire career, and that's a dark night at a strange theatre called Club Silencio. How do you get to Club Silencio in downtown LA? How do you access this extraordinary experience? Well, if we follow Lynch's creative geography, entering this place means going around the back of the Palace Newsreel Theatre, an abandoned movie house first built in 1911. But to get inside Club Silencio today, you have to go around the corner and onto Broadway, a street which in the 1930s contained the largest concentration of cinemas in the world. Broadway exemplified downtown LA's film culture, a communal experience of the movies that, as in many cities, has now been silenced. Of the dozen ornate cinemas still standing on Broadway, some offer the occasional special screening, others provide shooting locations for movies, but most lie empty. Indeed, the decaying movie theatre has been one of the most iconic symbols of post-war urban decline throughout the US. Cinema chains already threatened by television have followed white middle-class Americans out to the suburbs. Having always been associated with urban space, cinema has been transported to warehouses or shopping malls by the freeway system. America's downtown film culture, we might say, has been silenced. The Club Silencio scene in Mulholland Drive was shot inside this building on Broadway, the Tower Theatre. This was an extravagant place to see a film, containing marble columns and chandeliers. The auditorium itself had an innovative air conditioning system, which was advertised as a form of manufactured weather, as if it could produce thunder and lightning for real. What might the history of the Tower Theatre have to do with the strange goings-on that occur there in Mulholland Drive? Well, when it opened in 1927, this was the first cinema in LA to be equipped for talking pictures. That is, the first cinema in LA where sound and image came together on the screen. Accordingly, events at Club Silencio in Mulholland Drive are greatly concerned with how sound and image combine, with cinema's illusionary potential and our own complicity in this deception. During an emotional performance, the singer collapses, and yet the audience remains entranced by her continuing voice. With these conventional parameters now shattered, the film's entire narrative structure begins to crumble and reform. The vast illusion that confronts the characters in the theatre brings to light the phantasmatic foundations of their own lives. This realization takes place within a building no longer performing its original purpose, but which remains evocative to all those who walk along Broadway. It's soundtracked by a song taken out of its original context. You'll remember it's Roy Orbison's Crying, which is performed in Spanish. But this defamiliarization only seems to imbue it with additional uncanny emotion. This relentless mediation of the space demonstrates that for Lynch, pure architectural meaning is as slippery as artistic authenticity. And I was thinking here again of what Ian said about affective space earlier, and Brian, your emphasis on affect as something that film can provide architects with an understanding of in terms of relation to space. What's experienced at Club Silencio is not limited to an exploration of sound, though. It concerns language too. Because from the pronouncements made by the master of ceremonies at the club to the version of crying we hear, this is a venue that speaks Spanish. Los Angeles' relationship with its Spanish heritage remains highly controversial. When LA's downtown cinemas began to struggle in the 1950s, several of them turned to Spanish entertainment rather than face total silence. I think in this context, Lynch's use of the term Club Silencio might allude to the manner in which LA's Hispanic identity has been historically silenced, as well as the fate of downtown film culture in general. Club Silencio encourages us to think about the vernacular of Los Angeles. What language does this city speak? Who does and who doesn't understand it? And whose voices have been silenced here? We might need to unravel or unlearn certain narratives about LA's history as well. Finally, we arrive at Inland Empire, which is Lynch's last film, perhaps his final film, and I think his most radical work. Edward Soja once famously suggested to quote, "It all comes together in Los Angeles," a claim that economic and social issues of global importance manifest themselves most strongly in LA. In kind, we might say that Inland Empire, a title which refers to a region in the Pacific Northwest where Lynch grew up, and an area in Southern California, as well as perhaps evoking Central Europe, this is where it all comes together for David Lynch. For Inland Empire is a film about old and new worlds, symbolic territories that clash, merge, and overlap. It switches between various unexplained spaces, denying the spectator any geographical confidence. It creates a series of uncertain regions between the supposedly ethereal world of film and the traditional solid materiality of the built environment. And this, I think, might suggest that we can undermine regular conceptions of both cinema and architecture. Yet, while Inland Empire appears to rupture all spatial conventions, it maintains a certain emotional coherence. As the film critic Daniel Frampton states, to quote, "We understand what this film is about, even if we don't think we do." And this claim is also one I think that in a paradoxical fashion contributes to our understanding of how Lynch unlearns a desire to get it. So, what is Inland Empire all about? In search of an answer, we should look at an encounter early on in the film. And it's a meeting between a Hollywood actress named Nikki Grace, played by Laura Dern here, she's married to a possessive Polish man, and her encounter is with a spooky woman with a strong Central European accent. And this woman's strange comments provide us with a certain degree of guidance to Inland Empire. Firstly, she introduces herself to Nikki as, to quote, "your new neighbour." And the neighbour is a category that always prompts suspicion in Lynch's films. Lynch is as sceptical as Freud when it comes to the biblical command to love thy neighbour, demonstrating that our definition of neighbourly status is based as much on social or historical factors as geographical proximity. Who or what then might be considered as neighbours in Inland Empire? Secondly, this spooky visitor asks Nikki about her latest film role. Is it about marriage, she asks. Marriage is perhaps the most palpable theme in Inland Empire, a film which is full of jealousy, lust, and affairs. Fidelity is certainly at stake here, but fidelity to whom, or rather, to what? For Inland Empire is a story as concerned with geographical relations as personal affairs, with spatial as well as sexual couplings. Its many transatlantic pairings pivot on the marriage of Łódź in Poland and Los Angeles in California. This new neighbour becomes increasingly threatening and begins to talk of an unpaid bill, a phrase which I think we should extend beyond financial matters to consider the spatial and cultural debts that involve Central Europe and Southern California. To discover an unpaid bill within the marriage of Łódź and Los Angeles, we should examine the locations Lynch utilizes in Inland Empire. At one stage in the film, Nikki finds herself wandering at night amongst a group of prostitutes on Hollywood Boulevard. Suddenly, in the middle of the scene, the action cuts to a snowy evening in Łódź. A parallel lineup of women emerges, consisting of the same actresses we saw in America, but now dressed in the wintry fashions of the 1920s. In Inland Empire, these Polish scenes act as a ghostly double to the accompanying Hollywood story. American actions are placed alongside European doppelgangers, as if the New World is reenacting scenes that have previously occurred across the Atlantic. In particular, it's the history of cinema that is crucial to these scenes. After World War II, Łódź became home to one of the most prestigious film schools in Europe, which includes Andrzej Wajda, Krzysztof Kieślowski, and Roman Polanski amongst its alumni. It also grew into a major site of cinematic production, earning the inevitable nickname Hollywood. Even the city's industrial decline in recent decades has created a cinematic affect. Daniel Libeskind, who was born in Łódź, claims that his hometown now appears to, quote, to be made of cardboard, a decaying set for a movie that wrapped long ago. This, of course, is the kind of unreal quality often attributed to Los Angeles, as if it's a city of stage sets. In Inland Empire, Lynch pairs Hollywood Boulevard with this street in Łódź. In reality, these Polish women line up adjacent to the city's current Museum of Cinematography, as if searching for celluloid immortality. Elsewhere in the city, Hollywood even has its own Walk of Fame, commemorating the lights of Polanski. These golden stars replicate the famous icons in LA, and Lynch alludes to this dual cinematic heritage by having Nikki eventually collapse on one of Hollywood Boulevard's star plaques. But Hollywood Boulevard, as Inland Empire emphasizes, is no longer the grand walkway of cinema. It's now as decayed as one of Philadelphia's factories, a place for prostitutes and the homeless, an alley behind the marketplace. What might this, Lynch implies, tell us about the state of American cinema? Once again, urban decline is twinned with the fate of the movie business. Inland Empire stresses that the histories of Central Europe and Southern California are deeply intertwined, that the two regions are, we might say, married. For Lynch, Los Angeles, so often seen as the city in which to make a fresh new beginning, remains haunted by the moods, spaces, and spirits of its ancestors. Lynch himself is particularly indebted to the incredible range of talent that moved from Europe to the United States in the 1920s and 30s, the era in which many of the Polish scenes in Inland Empire appear to take place. Many of these figures, such as Billy Wilder or Fritz Lang, would take a crucial role in developing US cinema, while emigre architects such as Neutscher or Mies van der Rohe would redefine modernist architecture in the US. The emigration of so many crucial cultural figures is one of the defining geographical movements of the 20th century. Perhaps then we might see Inland Empire as Lynch's acknowledgement that his own career and the rise of the Hollywood cinema that inspired him, as well as the development of the Californian architectural modernism that he so admires, all of these constitute an unpaid bill to European creditors. Where does this leave Łódź today? The city currently finds itself in one of those uncertain zones that Lynch has so often manipulated. It sits in an alley behind the marketplace. Łódź is trying to reinvent itself as a post-industrial city of conference centres and shopping malls. A major part of these regeneration plans was due to be Gary's Cultural Centre, decorated with images from Inland Empire. However, severe funding problems after the financial crisis have stalled this project. It's another unpaid bill that haunts Łódź. With Inland Empire in mind, Gary's appropriation of Lynch's film might seem like a supplementary vow to Łódź's marriage with Los Angeles. And Gary, it's worth remembering, was also born to Polish parents and subsequently made his name in LA, of course. I think it'd be easy to conclude that the building and this film share a similar architecture, with Gary's jarring forms reflecting the irregular narrative of Inland Empire. But at the same time, Inland Empire feels ill-suited for assimilation into a glossy regeneration project. The fact that Gary's plans remain unrealized seems, to me at least, rather more in keeping with the architecture of Lynch's film. Notably, Hal Foster has in recent years examined with skepticism a number of the strands running through the celebrated creations of contemporary architects such as Gary or Jean Nouvel. In particular, Foster criticizes the kind of grandiose architecture which, instead of activating our senses, tends to subdue us. Such buildings, Hal Foster argues, provoke, to quote, a stunned subjectivity. By contrast, I'd like to conclude, Lynch's architecture is a constant provocation. Rather than producing the stunned subjectivity that Foster identifies as a common response to contemporary design, the worlds that Lynch has built and filmed force us to confront the strange forces, unspoken histories, and misrememberings involved in urban change. Through his awareness of how architectural knowledge interacts with cultural and psychological associations, Lynch encourages us to reassess the everyday forms that shape our lives, to unlearn what has become habitual. This might involve walking through the alley behind the marketplace, but then that's where he's located such a compelling perspective on cinema and architecture. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Doreen and this is Sarah, my colleague. And we are the last set of presenters, and it's been a really fascinating day. Our angle is slightly different because we both run research relating to film, art practices, and architectural media theories. But we will focus today's talk just on the studio we've been running at Leeds School of Architecture. So it started about 3 years ago, and we named it Cinematic Commons, to relate kind of in a simple way filmmaking and architecture making, and then relating it also to the context of city, in particular to infrastructural designs and critique. The studio has two directions of investigation. Firstly, a filmic and scenographic way of thinking through the architectural, and it's in defiance of oversimplified reading of cities through conventional regimes of visualization such as mapping, diagrams, numerical quantities, and vectors. And secondly, it investigates both the process of designing and teaching, process of design and the teaching of design that are mediated through a new combination of filmic, essayistic, and scenic constructs. This twofold investigation has since opened up new definitions of what is real, as that which is negotiated between the filmic and the architectural, and what is common, as that which enables a new process of articulating and producing shared spaces and identities in contemporary cities, which has problems of ardent segregation and boundaries. And today we will present to you three strategies that we've been exploring. The first is called the essayistic gaze, and the second one is called journeying take, and the third one is called the scenic construct. And to demonstrate, as also a speculative question, how they constitute a new spatial category of filmic commoning. And many of these ideas were presented in several conferences before, but now we have extended our research context from London to Mumbai for the last 2 years, and this year we're starting to investigate Mexico City. We will introduce each strategy with fragments of scenes taken from reference works of film, art, theater, or performance. We refer to these works as a significant inspiration and provocation of our investigation. And we will include examples of students' work from our design unit as a way to demonstrate how the teaching of design is also been implicated. And this is a summarizing poster of a really interesting workshop and exhibition we set up in Mumbai in collaboration with Columbia University's graduate school, Studio X, also based in Mumbai. And we ran a series of workshops, exhibition, and forum. And that kind of is the background. This is a shot of the installation. And several of our initial examples is actually based in Indian film context and how it relates to Mumbai in particular as a city.
The infrastructure of trains form important characters in Matushi Dutta's documentary film Suburban Islands and a Metro of 2007. It explores various ways of migration in Mumbai. The film reveals the cultural subcultures of these inhabitants as invisible citizens and fringe dwellers which keeps the city moving. Dutta conjured narratives of commoning in a metropolis through motifs of arrival and departure and conversations with citizens. These narratives are riddles for the present. Graveyards speak, application forms disappear, Bombay ducks glisten, fisherwomen and coffee vendors grumble, city maps haunt, vehicles rumble through the night. Two writers, Sadat Hassan and Manto and Ismat Chungti, act the fictionalized characters who gather riddles to retell their stories of the impressible rhythm of the city. At the Chinese cemetery, the monk explains in Hindi, the first Japanese to ply their trade in this port city were 200 prostitutes. And here, a burial service offers a lullaby to a man asleep on a nearby grave. Overnight, a European graveyard is transformed into a living quarters by a migrant Tamil community. Marbles stolen from Jewish graves across the road are part of temples, and children hop in and out through the window from an unseen swing behind a watchman of the Chinese cemetery. The surreal images cut into the real to offer a truth through the city's history and geography, revealing the contrary world views that make up Mumbai's rambling public sphere. It is the film as a whole as a representation of a possible commons, not a space or place within the film. The deliberate siting of the studio projects adjacent to the so-called infrastructure challenges the production of urban space adjacent to that used to be called public works. Firstly, the interrogation of the domain of imageries transversing architectural, urban planning and filmmaking practices. And secondly, we researched the intensive and extensive film industry in Mumbai, and this is revealed through the filmic documentation and architecturally analyses the organisation of spaces, activities, people, resources, production and distribution. So we formed links with the Cinema City project, part of Mumbai University, which was developed across 5 years, and it's exemplary of its attempt to make sense of a terrain with a set of urban, territorial and physical rules. And at the same time, it is a domain of exchange, negotiation and collective operation, a construct of commons. An inspiration for our trajectory from filmic construct to architectural commoning, the project summarises: architecture carries with it a burden of hope. It cannot be embroiled in the utopian project of anticipatory illuminations. It is a domain that is of building for betterness. Architects and urban planners are as involved in telling stories as filmmakers are. They tell stories through images that are drawings to make their arguments. They evoke idealizations and retreat to a mother's arms, the logic of science, the pleasure of a garden, efficiency and cleanliness, freedom and liberty, as escape from the labyrinth, dungeon, prison, chaos of the city. They call upon archetypes of images regarding the state of the city. These too get consumed in the clamour of images scattering the city into parts. They are at best provisional paradises whose spectres join the innumerable ghosts that haunt the city. This is how the Master of Architecture unit intends to understand and intervene in the context of London imploding with Crossrail's subterranean insurgencies and Mumbai's controversial historical and contemporary appropriation of Maidens and Colombo Dock areas.
As you can see from the clips that we've shown and the actual topic on the essayistic take, involving actually people that's very well known, Chris Marker, Autolus Group, and Harun Faruqi as our three primary references. Precisely because the film essay returns to political and cultural events. And in this part, we really investigate the recursive mechanism which is embodied within the essay film as a genre and also as a tool. It has the power to comment and criticize representational assumptions. It brews more open conspiracy than the devious honesty of fictional documentary. As philosopher Rancière describes essayist Chris Marker as who underlines for us the evidence that the image itself provides of what our memory tends to forget, and our thought resists conceptualization, or to stress the insignificance or ambivalence of the image, then left to its own devices, and then the concomitant need of making all of its possible readings explicit. Such medium and the process, when actively employed in the architecture studio, allows penetrative gazes of journalism, documentary, fiction, script, confession, autobiography to multiple engage with the definition of territories, activities, and temporal spatial organizations. The eyes, camera lens, this is a still from Autolus Group's film projects. Scenic set and film screens through the construct of the essayistic gaze are locked in a reciprocal relation, preventing the fulfillment of the desire of any one projection to master the gaze. This differentiates the essayistic filmic construct of the architectural commons from the established agenda of cinematic architecture, which we'll discuss in a bit later. The first act in the studio is the interrogation through the gaze, and this self-awareness of the foreign gaze, which is an exercise that we set the students to do from the first instance onwards, as they enters the context and enters the spatial imagination. And this combination of both the immersive personal view with the detached power of commentary on actuality. The act of revisiting is central to the essay film, recognizing repeated attempts to give differential articulations to the voice of I in relation to the voices of others. As Adorno argues in Essayist Form, he states, its efforts reflect the leisure of a childlike person who has no qualms about taking his inspiration from what others have done before him. The essay reflects what is loved and hated. Luck and play are essential to it. And so naively, yet conscientiously taking the position of not accepting, the essay film returns to reinterpret, waging trivial trials towards a truth which may have been extinguished at the dead end of objectification. Eschen, who is part of the Autolus Group, a contemporary film essays, turns it a drive of dissatisfaction. A drive of dissatisfaction. The essay's discontent with the duties of an image and the obligations of a sound. The unity of my eyes as camera is disrupted by my eyes, not camera, others as camera, and to the extent that none holds any absolute sense of dominance. The return in the essay film is that which makes possible the construction of the foreign gaze, with the power to straddle fiction and non-fiction. And these are stills from Harun, well, actually it's a compilation of stills, Harun Faruqi's work. projects. And at the same time, it becomes concretely personal and indeterminately plural. The foreignness is twofold: a detachment and a return recognition. And so the exercise of foreign gaze is often done twice and 3 times across the academic year in numerous ways, which in the construct of the essay film is exploited to full effect. Theorist and critic Javari explains the twofold role of the foreign gaze as that which not only a fascinating mediation of foreignness, but also an intriguing reassessment of the cultural history of a society. Society that secrets its own place, as Lefebvre puts it, and that the task of the gaze is not so much in the stripping secrets, turning it into dissecting knowledge, but to attempt to giving it a rightful place of representation as secret. How it came about, how it relates to other secrets, or relating to what it is not. And this is an example of foreign gaze as a film and the storyboards that we ask students to make in the context of Mumbai. And in this, the subject matter is about marketing places. So we're marching into the second section, which is journey and take.
Chantal Stoneman, Lost Highway. Within this essay, there is only one night, there is only one city, there is only one road. Along the highway, the night passes by, insomniac and fragile, made invisible by the metal shell and the speed of a vehicle inviting us where others have not been invited. Protected by the aggression of the night, we are surprised with a flash moment by the people inside their home. We dine at their table, watch their TV, sleep in their bed. Suddenly, their intimacy is offered to us. As a silent invitation, we are with the other. The anonymous are much more than the story that contains them. In Mumbai, Chantal Stoneman begins a dialogue. These black and white photographs are taken from the flyover that crosses the city. In the backdrop of the unsuspecting night, suspended in a multitude of lighted windows, swine like so many promises. They reveal tiny fragmented worlds, simple or complicated, overflowing or solitary. Lost Highway tells this tale shared by all big cities, where families are the same love, loneliness, the same muted violence, waiting for the same slowness. All are the same size of a universal language. The city is revealed at the pace of the flyovers that cross them. G.G. Skari's site-specific installation elevator from the subcontinent of the Indian Pavilion of 2011 Venice Biennale is an elevator cabin with an automatic door system. One enters the lift, the 3 side walls are backlit with projectors and images, as well as video animation, producing the effect of moving through the levels of the building, bringing visitors to the different social stratifications and witness the hierarchical scale within society. Detached from the material reality, the lift enclosure becomes a third space. The lift is sited within the pavilion, divided into nearly equal quadrants, one diagonal connecting the open spaces and near monochromatic graphic programs of Hashmi and Said, and another diagonal connecting the enclosures of Skari and DMC. Skari invoking a visual stratosphere of classes within his elevator. The Design Machine Collective, resonant with aura of industrial ruin itself, the quadrant itself relays the deep spatial archetypes indwelling in Indian culture. The space releases various temporalities. the compressed histories of petition, asporia, travel, apprenticeship and conversation across borders. The installations rupture with pre-existing notions of how India's national art scene should be represented, acting out contexts and outcomes within the Indian pavilion experiment, which can be described as being in equal parts laboratory, stage and school. Zarina Hashmi, Panit Soy and Gigi Skari and the Design Collective, Machine Collective act as compass points for an alternative atlas of references. An idiosyncratic line of latitude connects them across the globe, running east-west to link their theatres of life and work across New York, Amsterdam, New Delhi, Kerala. The idea of India to deploy a phrase made famous by political scientist and essayist Sunil Nahali could be tested. Such a shift allows us to view India as a conceptual entity that is not territorially bound, but which extends outward into a global space of the imagination. It assumes the form of fragments, arguments, dreams, memories and visions. Temporally rhythmic with these engagements, it's varied and can integrate multiple timelines of conception and productions. The audience could ask, who is the audience for contemporary global art?
And another two important reference in our journalistic take section would be Patrick Keeler and also the painter Julie Maretto, which I'll show in a minute. And so every story is a travel story, a spatial practice. For this reason, spatial practices concern everyday tactics are part of them. The Sator discloses the journey that occurs before the journey. Those narratives as texts, as imageries, as combination of sounds, actions, memories, that simultaneously produce geographies of actions and commonplaces of an order. It is the return of the gaze in the essay film which produces the collapse, the traumatic and the consuming process of the self becoming and being confronted by another self, the foreign, the alienated. The foreign gaze produces a vertiginous return, trapped, as the Sator states, in the very heart of the mechanical order, the machinery of representation. Defoe's Caruso, Robinson Crusoe, which is a reinvented protagonist in Keeler's work, as the prototype of scriptural celibate machine, the doubling of self, the gaze into the mirror, focuses the language that endlessly fabricates itself. The incarnation finally interrupted by an absence of other that returned to the shores of the island by the print of a man's naked foot on the shore. And that has been quoted in Defoe. Instability of the limit sets and the frontiers yields to something foreign. And Defoe's Robinson, transfigured as Keeler's Robinson, penetrates both infrastructural and infraspatial journeys. Setting off the machinery of the essayistic travel, and below I show a kind of configuration. It's one of the rare plans that we attempted to show, where space is being taken over by the essayistic journey. Setting off the machinery of the essayistic travel, the filmic conjugated with the linguistic, the narrative, cartographic, pictorial, mythical, and speculative, giving the infra, in the infrastructure, its supra-dimension, its own visible double. The angst of confronting one's own self and the intrusions of a foreign self grant access to invisible layers of a city, and setting off the machinery of representation, making possible a visibility, a story, an inhabitation, a catalyst, a project, and in the Sator's terms, a practice. Context, through these penetrative movement, scenes, commentaries, and actions, begin to speak as subjects, not a fixed construct in spatial discourses. At the core of everyday essayistic journey is an architectural project. Essayistic film journeys often unfold along the lines of narratives of self-transformation in which the unfamiliar, the foreign environments that the subject displays act as catalysts for personal change. By considering this effect of transformation on the films themselves as cultural products, the process of international circulation of film as commodities are investigated within our work in relation to representational remaking. And this relates back to the earlier example of the Cinematic City project, and also in Chantal Stolman's work. The foreign gaze studies in this part, in this mobility of the film as a cultural product, and the cultural interaction and exchange of the filmic is both studied with architectural effect in mind. And this is the work of Julie Mehretu, who is a painter. So all the following slides that you see, they are two-dimensional representation of architectural elements and also historical memories that she built narratives of war, of disintegration of society, of migration, of fear, into these canvases. And she has a particular way of layering them and spraying them with translucent material and layering on another element and spraying them again. So her canvases are really quite thick. They're almost like 2.5 dimension in those ways. And she will use architectural representational tools, so things like perspectival setup, plans and sections, elevations, and but then again drawing them and then erasing them and deleting them and drawing them and camouflaging them with another layer of representation. And this is actually the subject matter is concerning Berlin as a city which is also undergoing vast transformation in the past century. And this is a detail of the kind of layering that she applies. And so this is again another one of our escape from just simple plans and sections to describe spaces, but then to start to add kind of journeying across the canvas, even though it's a 2-dimension, it still involves kind of a reading through time and reading through space. So we're marching into the third section, which is the scenic construct.
The performance in Marylebone, London, 2008, started as the audience took their seat in the windowless vault, once used to test concrete resistance for the Channel Tunnel. Screens rise to reveal an installation consisting of an uncanny stack of 5 pianos, stripped of covers exposing their sides and interdispersed with 3 tree branches, in front of which reveal large rectangles flooded with water and yellow light pouring down like the sun. An unseen actor read from Schifter's passage describing a woodland covered in snow, and Jacob van Woestaal's view of a marsh is projected onto the screen, and the floor appears to become a frozen lake. Next, rain begins to fall and ice melts. Small swirls of vapor rises and the mood shifts while the pianos play with no pianists from the second movement of Bach's Italian Concerto in F major. Of the 5 pianos, 2 uprights are played by invisible fingers striking keys and small hammers hitting strings following the traditional mechanism. The rest are played by robotic arms gliding down the strings. Time has changed, the voice of Malcolm X echoes across the space. The intensity of recording many aspects of nature's wonders through deceleration of time and heightened awareness of the smallest details is abundant in Schifter's writing and anticipation of many of today's ecological changes. His literary journeys are dedicated enthusiastically to describing phenomena of the margins of event, sets them in new rhythms and rituals, and in particular giving voices to cultures that are different and peripheral to what is dominant and taken for granted. The margins become the centre here. Other voices woven into the play are William Burroughs, Malcolm X, Claude Van Strauss, as well as traditional Greek songs welcoming immigrants and strangers. At the end of the performance, the audience is invited to inspect the set, gadgets, machinery, screens and water as more and more within the construct, to look around and immediate encounter with the unfamiliar. Goebbels' emphasizes how much he likes those moments. It sets the human body in a relation to non-human machinery, immersing into things. Even when you're not involved with yourself, you're seeing someone else walking around. You relate to humanity with the elements which you cannot master. The actor has her back to the audience and does not look in the direction of the camera. The camera does the work for us and acts as our point of view. Here Kirsten describes prepares a meal of kidney for Jean. She winds up the clock, she cleans the vegetables, she tests the sharpness of the knife, and then cuts the kidney. We see what Kristen sees. The subjective image is, according to Deleuze, the thing seen by someone qualified or interior to the set. We see the knife through the eyes of Kristen, perhaps barely noticed by the audience. Kristen's double enacts the same gestures downstage at the table where close-up the cutting is shot. Now we see a small lamp being switched on, now the camera being focused on the tabletop. When the cutting in this scene, the double does not even need a camera operator. She becomes her own operator, focusing the lens on the small lit area of the tabletop, then proceeding to the cut. Mitchell is creating a double set for us to experience as a montage on screen. The actors are followed by 5 cameras and an army of technicians performing a live film which comes together in a large central screen. Sound is recorded on stage, but separately. A cellist for music, table crammed with objects is for a simple soundtrack, and incidental sounds, recording booths, stage side for voice. The simple meat preparing scene splices live footage of 2 actors performing simultaneously in different corners of the set. The stage has become what Rancière would call a little optical machine. The film, contrastingly, is slow and atmospheric, with diffused lighting. The production is Katie Mitchell's adaptation of Strindberg's Fräulein Julie.
In this part of scenic construct, and we have references to Heiner Goebbels' Stifter's Ding installation project. I think it's supported by Art Angel. Katie Mitchell, Fräulein Julie, based on Strindberg's text. Coe Brothers, Dark Arches. Installation The Dark Arches of Leeds. Wes Anderson's film sets, Diller School Video, and Liz Gard as installation artist. The coming together of a scene, an assembly of incongruous elements construed as a temporary reality, is often considered as a core concern in the theatrical practice. From perspectival techniques of visual depth created between 2-dimensional backdrops and 3-dimensional props, to the intrusion of camera lens in the production set for photography or for film. Various means to simulate a scene designate how we conceive, construct, perceive, communicate, and interpret visual realities. Hubert Damisch, art historian, philosopher, describes such scenographic process of deliberately convincing yet illusory transformation as grafting. From a flat, simulated painted space with streets, houses, and cities to semi-reliefs, to semi-models, to a magnificent city with the real streets and 3-dimensional details outside the space. For instance, painted architecture elements were grafted onto model elements in the set, then grafted onto material construction of the theater, and theatrical realities were grafted onto real realities as actualities, as experience. From the city outside to the city inside, from the painted city to the city imagined, these transitions overlapped and reached into one another, yet displace indiscernible overlaps and reach into gaps gnawing at viewer's mind. The grafted scene had and only had a partial integrity, which, although with blurred boundaries, resists complete smoothing over to retain distinction between participating realities. And this notion of the gap is very significant for us when we come to discuss interstitial potential within the city. The scenographic strategies of incongruous co-presence of realities held in one scene makes possible the alteration of relation between givens and multiple differences. A scene is a synthetic togetherness that requires work, a work that's both from those who are acting within the scene and work from those who are sitting in the audience, which according to Rancière, the little optical machine, which Sarah just mentioned, captures concepts at work. in their relation to the new object they seek to appropriate, old objects that they try to reconsider, and the patterns they build or transform to this end. He pushes his work as a deliberate action of collecting towards a sensible reality of communism, as in communicable realities, less intending it as a political ideology, but more as a tangible situation of commonness, of shared concept becoming thinkable and imaginable. By forsaking the narrative's continuity, the essayist's mise en scène project voices from different positions with respect to the scenic setup, horizontally or laterally, or from the sides, as some critics have remarked, rather than linearly, aligned with the point of view or flow of time. This empowers the essayistic scene with the possibilities of an architectural commons. The architectural experience is defined not only through a mode of distraction, according to Walter Benjamin, but also the revelation of a scene grafted with differential voices and gazes, echoing what Benjamin has speculated the affinity between the filmic medium, architectural experiences, and subjectivity of modern city inhabitants. Strategies of a grafted scene and the reconfigurable set-lens-screen relation can lead to a different kind of architecture making. And this is an example from Dylan Scofidio, who has grafted their architecture through several devices in instrument making and filmmaking. It enables possibilities of gathering and grafting of differences in medium and in opinion, of gaps and voids that become seeds of change, and more profoundly a set of critical actions in defiance of the oversimplistic translation from the two-dimensional to the three-dimensional construct of space. And these are examples of installation work and video work by artist Anne Lisgard, who works with time lapses and also videoing work in real spaces and projecting back into another space adjacent to it. In a way, it's a play on Dan Graham's experiment in the few decades ago, and actually bringing in a kind of a digital rendering reality, to introducing it as another reality which we can mirror in and also to relay in time. To relate film to architecture through the scenographic construct caught in the lens of essayistic gaze not only fulfills the imaginability of architecture, but more so punctuates the self-referential autonomy of architecture with the interrogative grafting of imageries, texts, and voices. Architecture that involves the meta-language of cinema, of filmic assembly, can be a critical instigator of the scene of a shared commonness. Again, we're returning to this term and trying to redefine what it means within our process, which is not a given but a necessary work to allow the society to remember, to dream, and to build. And I just want to go back a few slides to we must pay homage to Pascal Schoning's unit at DAA, which ran for over two decades, cinematic architecture, and to pay homage in the sense of how it inspires and how we are working differently across, and especially the type of references that we're offering to the audience today actually has a very, very strong physicality. So we're building back the sense of materiality and physicality back into what maybe Pascal has imagined as the cinematic architecture, which is always an attempt to escape from the physical confined to imaginary and symbolic domain. And actually, I think the meta language of architecture for Pascal is very significant in his cinematic architecture. And it has long been characterized by dematerialization, where constructs are akin to stages, which constantly changes. So stages is still there, but then at the end, it's meant to be disassembled. It's not meant to get in the way of the actual architecture. And encouraging user to interact in dramatic ways, dissolving material surfaces through projections of images, shadows, and light. Triggering metaphysical dialogues, imaginations. So this utopia of pure cinema is very significant for us, but then we contemplate probably a more tangled involvement with context. And therefore, we do name our context very specifically to say we do work with Mumbai, and we do work with Mexico City in a very, very specific way and with a group of people. And also the physicality of the architectural construct is something which can be certain in the sense that it can be translated into plans and sections if it needs to be. But then the filmic journey is something which it cannot arise without. The essay film, precariously naive as it may be, is research without the pedestal of scientific neutrality. It is propositional without imposed hierarchy. It is engagement without the loss of boundary. It is dialogue without the dissolution of decision-making and responsibility. So in a sense, there is still a figure of the architect in these constructs. It is action without polarization of politics or ideologies. It is identity of commonality without the unilateral access of individuality. And from here onwards, we'll show more of an example of students' work at different stages of their learning process.
This is Amy Majors constructed a set consisting of layers of perspectively distorted backdrops and choreographed a filmic journey into history and memory of Berlin as part of an investigation into the UNIX workshop set lens scene. She states, the cinematic experience in many ways is synonymous with architectural experience and its physical construct of time and space, texture and memory. The compilation of archival footage to create a short film essay allowed me to effectively express the main theme of my thesis project, relating to the significance of personal memories in the city of Berlin. The memory machine emerged as a new way of expressing personal accounts and experiences of the city as an alternative to static and formal nature of monuments and museums. The various parts of the machine will be used to store and project artifacts donated by people of Berlin, and the construct of each space will provide an experimental reflection of particular emotions and senses associated with spatial qualities and memories. The final film will be a key summation of the project, reflecting a possible journey through the memory machine.
Yeah. And this is an example of a student looking at the context of London. And apologies for the faintness of these line drawings, but we do introduce axonometrics as a way, often in a very kind of fragmentary sense, to give some precision to spatial definition. But usually they will journey through these exercises before they get to this point. And I'll talk a bit about that.
Yes. So in terms of kind of formal arrangement, this is just split into 3 sections, so you kind of understand some of the techniques in terms of representation and also the project. So yeah, we offer observation, forensics and translation by initially using the foreign gaze. Students construct their own foreign gaze essay, film essay, because they've not necessarily been to the place before and we can't necessarily get there immediately, to kind of critique and find some at the essence of their thesis. And they work with storyboards to work with, and also making installations on site. They complete a set of forensic studies, which is obviously sometimes used by making another film and film stills. And we're using set making, rather than, we don't call them architectural models, we call them sets because we're using them to film and explore space. And we translate the program, often using complex or axonometric. And then the project, we are often dealing with these. So we've been tackling infrastructure at a larger level over 3 years. So dealing with, firstly, methods that kind of train and infrastructure of the Crossrail. Then we were looking at water in Mumbai, and now we're looking at aspects of new nature in London. So that's kind of an overview. And we've got a couple of examples, little clips of films, just to see some of the spatial techniques that some of the students have been working with. These are kind of sketches in a way, sketches through film, to explore space. It's overlay of drawings, models and sets. And this was an intervention in one of the stations in Mumbai. We're running out of time, so we'll just do some short clips. This was using model composition and refilming over projection to kind of gradually build up a drawing. So they filmed original models, projected onto the models, recorded it again and projected more film over the top. And this again is using the students' set models and a combination of projection set. And this was looking at a recycling project in Mumbai.
That's the drawing that accompanies it. And in the next few slides is a student, Joe, who's been working with ship dismantling industry in Mumbai, which is one way to call it the biggest graveyard for ships and boats in the world. And this is a still that's taken from manufactured landscape. So Botinsky's still that's taken also of the same industry. And the student made this is the first exercise, so this is a 4 gaze film that they will have to do. Very, very simple set models and interspersed with research about the scale of the operation that they're making. And this is an example of storyboards that you have to make. It's just slow. And this is a much larger drawing that's based on a series of previous interventions. And so he's taken apart these quite sculptural skeleton of the existing boat. And this is actually a very famous warship called Vikram, which is literally being taken apart in front of our eyes when we happen to visit Mumbai and the ship dismantling yard. Shipbreaking yard, and so it was a massively inspirational moment for him to study the effect of it. Sorry, these line drawings are very faint, but this is towards the end of the project, which he started to foster and to imagine new spaces. That's a combination of. This is an example of grafting, which I've been describing. Where the scenic construct and the essayistic gaze comes together to form a set of architectural reasoning for new activities and spatial language. And this is a very final slide, which shows a recent installation and exhibition work at the Tetley Gallery in Leeds, where we experimented with also, you can see more from the panorama down, where there's a series of different speed and duration of slide and stills, interspersed with these translucent sheets of line drawings and these cutouts, which is at the scale of 1:1 pretty much, to suggest new spaces. And this kind of walks through an immersive environment surrounded by these grafted elements. And thank you very much for your attention.